The Concordia Deception, Space Colony 1, Book 1, written and narrated by J.J. Green. Chapter 1. Their planet had no name, but they were about to fix that. The colonists had been using its dry scientific designation, or calling the planet their new home, long enough. The time had come to settle the question of what to call it and get on with the colonization. Cariad sat on the stadium bench, waiting for the leader to get to the point. The votes on the proposed names had been cast. All the leader needed to do was to announce the most popular choice. Then the job would be done and everyone could party. But like the natural politician she wasn't going to miss out on an opportunity to speechify. Cariad stifled a yawn, conscious that, sitting in the leader's box, she was under everyone's gaze. Ethan caught her eye and winked at her. He had to be finding the experience as tedious as she did. The rest of the audience was tiring of the drawn-out address too. The assembled gens and Woken were restless, and a low chatter had started up. Even the few guardians present, stiff in their uniforms, appeared to be struggling to maintain their attention. The leader began winding up her speech. At last! She consulted the interface on her podium. Placing a fingertip on the screen, she said, "I am pleased to announce the winning name is..." A massive explosion roared. The force hit Cariad, flinging her from her seat and through the air. She landed heavily, and her head struck something hard. Debris rained down, trapping her. There was a crunch that sounded terrifyingly like a bone breaking. She lay in the darkness, unable to move. Her ears rang. Dizzy and faint, she pushed against the wreckage holding her down, but it was too heavy. She couldn't move it, and one of her arms didn't seem to be working. She was losing consciousness. She fought to remain awake. She had to get out. She mustn't pass out. She mustn't. She had broken the hearts of everyone who loved her. She couldn't die within weeks of arrival. Her confused mind drifted, trying to make sense of what had happened. Her shift was over, but she wanted to check on the final batch of fetuses before she left for the naming ceremony down on the surface. She had time to catch the last shuttle planet-side if she didn't take too long. Planet-side. She smiled as she repeated the word in her mind. She was picking up the gens' vernacular. Their English wasn't very different from hers and the rest of the Wokens, despite the 184 Earth years that separated them. But the gens had invented new words. She admired their creativity, though other Woken made a point of not adopting the new terminology. Quite a few Woken stubbornly insisted on calling themselves the previously cryopreserved, or project scientists, and using the Nova Fortuna project's official designation for the gens, referring to them as the generational colonists. Still, the gens' words accurately described the new way of living. Why shouldn't she use them? In time, a blending of Woken and gen language was inevitable. She thumbed the code in the gestation room door and exhaled into the breath reader. The lock gave out its familiar metallic whir and clunk. She eased the heavy door open and stepped into the dim red light of the room. 50 thick-walled, transparent gestation bags hung in rows from the ceiling. Some of the bags were motionless. Others gently swayed or jiggled as the human infants inside squirmed or kicked, their tiny limbs testing the constraints of the artificial wombs. As she walked the aisles, Cariad checked the bag monitors. She could have checked the growing baby's vitals on her personal interface, but she liked to get a visual. She liked to see the little faces, slightly distorted by the pressure of the bag and the fluid that surrounded them. The babies would grimace and smile and yawn and suck their thumbs and sometimes even open their unfocused eyes. It was a pleasure to watch their personalities and habits developing even before they were decanted. Her comm chirped, and she lifted her lapel button to check it. Ethan was calling. She opened the channel. "You're still aboard the ship too? I thought you would have left by now." "I was packing the last of my stuff. I transfer planet side today. Do you want to meet in the shuttle bay?" "Sure, I'll be there in around 20 minutes. "I'll meet you at the entrance. Don't be late, I'm not waiting for you." Cariad chuckled as she closed the connection. Ethan would wait for her, even if it meant he might miss the shuttle and the ceremony. That was the kind of person he was. Taking a final look at the last generation of colonists ever to be decanted aboard the Nova Fortuna, Cariad left the gestation room, passed through the fertilization lab, and walked to the nearest transit bay. Her footsteps echoed faintly in the empty corridors. All but a skeleton crew would remain aboard for the duration of the naming ceremony. Afterward, most of the gens wouldn't return to the ship unless for a special reason. Cariad, as awoken, would be able to come and go as the shuttle schedule allowed. For the time being, she was needed aboard ship. She would assist in the final decanting and wrapping things up in the reproductive facilities. Shutting everything down properly was essential. If things didn't go according to plan, they might need to start up the processes again. What she would do after she'd finished her work aboard the Nova Fortuna, she hadn't yet decided. She would think about it during the naming ceremony. The transit car drew up, and she boarded the predictably vacant carriage. Without any more passengers to stop the car, she was whisked 6 clicks around the outer circumference of the Nova's gigantic spoked wheel in less than 10 minutes, arriving at the shuttle bay ahead of Ethan. A few more last-minute passengers passed her at the entrance while she waited for her friend. By the time she finally spotted him approaching, she was beginning to wonder if she would be the one who would miss the naming ceremony due to his delay. Ethan jogged closer, a large bag over his shoulder. "Sorry," he panted when he was within speaking distance. "Took longer than I thought." "That's okay, but we'd better run. The shuttle's leaving in 1 minute." They sped through the entrance and across the wide bay to the station at the very end, where a single shuttle stood, its ramp down. An attendant appeared as they approached and took Ethan's case to stow in the hold. The passenger cabin was nearly full, but they managed to find 2 seats together, where they sat and caught their breath as the pilot made the final checks and sealed the hatch. "I can't believe I almost missed the ceremony," said Ethan when his breathing had returned to normal. "What would I have told my grandkids when I'm old and grey? I'd have to make something up. Oh yes, Grandpa had a front row seat and saw everything. The leader forgot her words 3 times. No, that's no good. I'd have to think up something more interesting than that." "Whatever you made up, it would likely be more interesting than the actual ceremony. I know it's a momentous occasion and all, but I'm not looking forward to it. Our new leader's capacity for monotonous droning has to be some kind of record." "Didn't you know that's an essential requirement?" Ethan asked, straight-faced. "The candidates take a test after nomination. If they can't drone monotonously for at least 4 hours straight, they're not allowed to stand for election." Cariad chuckled, but when her laughter subsided, she said in a serious tone, "I still think it should be you up there speaking today. It's what most people want. They look up to you. You would make a great leader." No, I wouldn't, and I don't want that anyway." Her friend began to look uncomfortable, as he always did when she mentioned the issue, so Cariad let it slide. She would only be stating the obvious. The facts were plain. Ethan had saved hundreds of colonists' lives, practically single-handed during the first night attack, when a sabotage had led to an invasion of predatory native wildlife in the first encampment. Everyone knew of Ethan's heroism, though the man's role had never been formally acknowledged. The gens and even some of the Woken would have felt safer with Ethan in charge, but his self-effacement wouldn't allow him to contemplate the notion. "It's a pity you can't be leader. You would be perfect for the job. Plenty of people would vote for you." "No, it's right that none of the Woken can stand for election. We're from the old world. The new world belongs to you gens. We're only here to help with the transition." Ethan tutted and shook his head. "But if it weren't for you..." Cariad placed a hand on his arm. "We've talked about this often enough already. Let's not go over it again, huh?" He was referring to her actions that terrible night of the attack. She had figured out how to repel the predatory organisms, but he always overstated her role. It wasn't her who had nearly died saving others. What was more, Ethan was wrong to think the gens would countenance a Woken as leader. Gens viewed the Woken with a mixture of suspicion, envy, and animosity. The friendship between her and Ethan was rare. The window covers around the passenger cabin retracted. The shuttle had entered the atmosphere of the planet and would be landing soon. Cariad looked out at the view of the blue and green dome beneath them and wondered what the planet would be called. They dropped lower. The settlement was coming into view. At the center of the small town of prefabricated houses sat an open-air stadium. Within it were the tiny moving figures of 2,000 people. The surrounding streets were empty. Beyond the town, a low jungle of vegetation spread out. The life forms that had attacked the first night's camp had come from among the plants, and now a well-maintained electric fence and regular patrols protected against a reenactment of that devastating event. Cariad recalled the digging of the first cemetery afterward with sorrow. To one side of the settlement, the rest of the Nova's shuttles stood in short, neat rows. Standing out among them was the sleek, shiny shuttle that belonged to the Guardians, the most recent arrivals at the planet. Their ship, Mistral, humanity's first faster-than-light starship, hung in orbit above the New World like the Nova Fortuna did, though Cariad had never been to it. The Guardians hadn't invited any of the Woken or gens aboard. It was odd, but no one dared to challenge them on the subject. The shuttle was making its final descent, and Cariad realized that the normally talkative Ethan hadn't spoken for most of the flight. He looked pensive as he gazed out at the rapidly approaching shuttle pad. "Thinking about your new life? Have you received your allotment yet?" "I haven't. That's tomorrow, I think. All the farmers have a meeting in the morning. I expect they'll tell us then." "Is there any area you'd prefer? The lake area looks pretty." He shrugged. "I don't really mind what they give me. The work will be the same. Clear the land, plough, sow, reap, just as people always did on Earth." "You don't seem too happy about it." The cabin intercom chimed. "We have safely touched down," said the pilot. "Welcome to your new home." His announcement was met with cheers and applause. For some of the passengers, it was their first time on the planet's surface. If they worked in a profession that had kept them aboard the Nova, they might not have had the opportunity to go down until now, but everyone was invited to the naming ceremony. "Disembark from the rear," the pilot instructed. "That's the cool zone, and no pushing. You have plenty of time to get to the stadium before the ceremony begins." In spite of his words, the rising excitement in the cabin did result in a mild scuffle among the passengers in their eagerness to leave the vessel. Cariad and Ethan waited for the aisles to clear. When they finally arrived at the bottom of the ramp, a Guardian called Strongquist was waiting for them. He had never told Cariad his first name. Like all of the Guardians, Strongquist was tall, and he wore the Guardian uniform. A tunic of dark grey with thin white stripes, close-fitting and neat from his gaiters to the collar. His hair was drawn into a neat topknot, and not a trace of stubble was visible on his face. He nodded in greeting as they reached him. "Ethan, Cariad, it's a pleasure to see you again.
I was becoming concerned that neither of you would make it to the ceremony. None of the shuttles were posting manifests, and I believe this is the last one."
"You've been waiting for us all morning."
"I have, but that's no matter. It's been interesting to meet more colonists. Would you care to accompany me to the stadium?"
Cariad exchanged a subtle look with Ethan. Like her, he seemed uneasy about the invitation, but she couldn't think of a reasonable excuse to refuse. Everyone Cariad had spoken to about the Guardians seemed to share her unease regarding the newcomers. They had set out in their starship centuries after the Nova Fortuna had departed, their mission to warn the colonists of a plot to sabotage the colony, uncovered in historical documents. And they had been the colonists' ultimate saviours during the first night attack. No one could deny it. Yet they volunteered few details about themselves or the Earth they'd left behind, which was odd.
"I have to collect my luggage,"
Ethan said, and walked around to the hold. Stromquist was watching Cariad expectantly, waiting for her reply. "Sure, we can go together. Why not?" Ethan reappeared with his bag. He looked hopefully at Cariad, but his expression fell when it became clear she hadn't thought of a way to turn Stromquist down. The Guardian positioned himself in the middle of their small group as they left the shuttle pad and crossed the open area leading into the settlement. The passage of many feet had already worn paths through the rubbery, moss-like ground cover.
"You must both be very excited to be present at the naming of not only a new world,"
said Stromquist,
"but also humanity's first deep space colony. I know I am. It's quite something, don't you think? The names of every person present today will go down in history."
"Are we still the first, then?" Cariad asked, seizing the opportunity to probe the man for information. "No colony ships left after ours? I've always wondered about that." Stromquist looked like he'd swallowed a fly.
No, none did."
He paused.
"As you know, the natural movement was growing very powerful at the time the Nova Fortuna departed, and soon afterward it entered its heyday. The movement's influence continued for centuries."
He brightened his tone.
"But that's all in the past. Today we should be thinking about the future. And what a future it will be. Nova Fortuna colonists will thrive and spread across the planet. I'm sure of it. And, who knows, one day another colony ship may launch, and humanity will take a step farther out into the galaxy."
"That's a long way ahead," said Ethan.
"If we ever get there. I'll be happy if we make our first target of self-sustainability within 5 years. That's what we should be thinking about right now, not what our descendants might achieve. We'll all be dust by then. Practical as always, Ethan. I know I can rely on you to bring me back down to earth. Or rather, I wonder what name I should use. What did you vote for?"
He addressed the question to Cariad. "I didn't vote."
"You didn't? Why not?"
A, I don't really mind what we call it, and B, I don't feel I have the right."
"Don't have the right?"
Stromquist's tone was surprised. He turned to Ethan.
"What about you? Don't tell me you didn't vote either." "I did vote. I voted for—"
A klaxon sounded within the stadium. The ceremony was about to begin.
"Hurry up,"
Stromquist said.
"We don't want to miss the opening."
He grabbed Cariad's and Ethan's upper arms and urged them forward. Cariad squirmed free. "Ease up. It won't matter if we miss the first few minutes. The leader's going to speak for at least an hour before she gets to the point."
"Oh yes, it will matter. Come on, they're all waiting for you."
Cariad and Ethan stopped in their tracks. Stromquist turned to face them, then swept his arm in a wide curve, inviting them to lead the way. They shared a worried look. There seemed no other option than to do as Stromquist suggested, however. Together, the three went through the wide open doors that led into the stadium. A deafening cheer erupted from the assembled Gens, Woken, and Guardians. It was so loud and unexpected, Cariad's first impulse was to run, but Strongquist was right behind her, lightly pushing her forward. Along with her friend, she walked into the open area at the centre of the stadium, entirely bemused. She stood side by side with Ethan in the strong afternoon sunlight, while the crowd cheered and clapped. Eventually the noise began to die down, and the leader brought it down further by speaking over the broadcast system. At first, Cariad couldn't make out what she was saying, but as the cheering subsided, it became clear the woman was speaking about the first night attack and the roles Cariad and Ethan had played in it. At last, it all began to make sense. The leader was well aware the gens would rather have had Ethan in her position. By orchestrating this show of appreciation, she was piggybacking onto his popularity among the gens, and, to a lesser extent, Cariad's with the Woken. The leader would be perceived as gracious, humble, and generous. She was an intelligent woman. There was nothing Cariad could do except smile and bow to show her thanks. The leader talked for an excruciating 10 minutes or so, while Cariad and Ethan stood and waited for it all to be over. When she had finally, mercifully finished, and the audience had given another round of applause, they took the seats reserved for them in the dignitaries' box. A drop of water hit Cariad on the nose. She held out a hand, looking up at the sky. Grey clouds had blown in. The stadium roof would protect most of the seating areas, but it looked like the ceremony would be slightly spoiled by rain. She realized Ethan wasn't with her. He had left the box and was standing at the edge of the field, holding out both his hands and looking up in wonder at the sky. Gasps and murmurs were running through the crowd, and people were running down to the stadium centre. Rain had begun to fall, softening the light and dimming the view. Of course! Cariad laughed. It was the first time any of the gens had experienced rainfall. They had grown up aboard the Nova Fortuna, where water had been a precious commodity. Each drop had been carefully dispensed, collected and recycled. No gen had ever felt the rain on his or her face or listened to a thunderstorm at night. Nearly all of the 2,000 gens were wandering about the field, getting wet, grinning and whooping. Some of them were dancing. Cariad watched, her heart warmed by their enjoyment of the simple pleasure. Their lives on the new planet promised to be an amazing adventure. Chapter 2. Something was lying across Ethan's chest, pinning him down, and it was covering his face, so all he could see was darkness. His legs were free, however, and he didn't seem to be badly hurt. The only discomfort he could feel was an ache where he'd hit his head and the crushing pressure on his rib cage. All around him he heard sobs, screams and cries of pain. The memory of where he was flashed back into his mind. There had been an explosion. He began to struggle. He had to find Cariad. She could be seriously hurt. He had to help the others. He pushed against the thing trapping him. He felt it shift, and he pushed harder, grimacing with the effort. The object seemed to move toward his head, so he concentrated his efforts in that direction. The pressure on his chest began to lift. He pushed harder, drew up his knees, and used his legs to drag himself downward. As he eased out of the confined space, his chin caught on a metal corner. He twisted his head away, but he couldn't escape the sharp edge. He was panting with the effort of holding up the object above him, but he couldn't let it go. If he did that, the corner would descend into his neck. There was nothing for it. If he wanted to get out, he would have to drag his face down the corner. He took a deep breath and pushed upward as hard as he could. He lifted the trapping object another few millimeters and pulled with his legs. As he slid along, the corner bit into his skin at his jawline. He winced. A cut tore up his face to his cheekbone. He gasped in pain and paused for a fraction of a second before making a final effort. The corner grazed his eyelashes and hit his eyebrow. It drew another cut up to his forehead. With a yell of effort, he pulled himself the last few centimeters. He was finally free. His left eye immediately filled with blood, and more ran down his face and dripped from his chin. He sat up and looked about him with his one good eye, wiping the blood from the other. Before the explosion, he'd been seated in the leader's box. Now he was nearly at ground level, and the seating was in broken chaos all around him. A section had fallen onto him. He was lucky to have survived relatively unscathed. Some people from the unaffected parts of the stadium were running over to help. Some were already lifting the wreckage left by the explosion, desperately trying to free trapped victims. Still wiping the blood from his eye, he climbed to his feet. He had to find Cariad. She'd been sitting right next to him. She couldn't be far away. He scanned around and spotted a single white shoe. He was sure it was one of hers. Then he caught another glimpse of white deep within the jumbled remains of the seating. It was the other shoe. He was sure of it. He scrambled over shards of broken plastic and metal and put his face to the opening where the shoe was visible. He could see a glimpse of her ankle.
Cariad!
He repeated her name twice, but heard no reply, and her foot didn't move. He pulled at the remains trapping her, removing the mangled pieces one by one.
Have you found her?
Strongquist had appeared by Ethan's side.
Let me help you,
the Guardian said. Ethan briefly wondered where the man had been seated that had allowed him to survive the blast. He'd thought Strongquist had been sitting close by, but his fears about Cariad soon drove the thought from his mind. He could now see her leg. Blood spattered her dark skin. Together, he and Strongquist removed the remaining pieces that covered her. They each grabbed one end of a large section of seating and lifted it up. Beneath it, Cariad lay on her side. One of her legs was folded up, but looked okay. One of her arms was bent at an unnatural angle. Her clothes were stained red, and her eyes were closed. He crouched down beside her and gently touched her shoulder.
Cariad, don't move her,
said Strongquist.
Her neck could be broken. Is she breathing?
Ethan watched her chest, which rose and fell slowly.
Yes. Good. Stay with her. If she wakes up, keep her still and calm. I'll be back as soon as I can.
The Guardian stepped down over the seating and ran across the stadium field, heading for the exit that led to the shuttles. Other Guardians were working through the wreckage, but many gens were standing around in shock, simply watching what was going on, or wandering around the muddy ground aimlessly. Rain had begun to fall again, but this time hardly anyone seemed to notice. Ethan remained with Cariad, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. The fact that she didn't seem to be bleeding heavily reassured him a little, but he wished she would wake up. What had caused the explosion? There had been nothing explosive in the stadium, no fuels or anything under pressure. It had to be a bomb. But who would want to set off a bomb during the naming ceremony? He didn't have to think hard to answer that question. It had to be a member of the natural movement. After the sabotage on the first night attack, the perpetrator had been caught and executed. But now it was clear there was more than one of them. Natural movement fanatics were living among the colonists, determined to prevent the expansion of humanity into the galaxy. Memories of Lauren flooded his mind. He would never forget seeing her fall beneath one of the predatory native life forms on that fateful night. He couldn't erase the image of her remains from his memory. His feelings of loss were still raw. Looking down at Cariad, he swallowed. He couldn't face losing someone else he cared about. Her eyes were moving beneath their lids. They flickered, then opened wide in alarm. She tried to rise, but he gently restrained her.
You're okay, but you mustn't move. You've been hurt. Strongquist has gone for help. You're going to be all right, but you need to stay still."
She seemed to hear him because she stopped struggling. Her gaze sought out his. When their eyes met, he managed a small smile to try to reassure her, but he imagined the sight of his bloody face was less than reassuring. She struggled to speak, but he couldn't make out the words.
"Don't worry, we'll get you fixed up. Everything's going to be okay."
Strongquist was back. He'd brought 2 of his guardian buddies with him, and they were carrying a board somewhat like a stretcher, and other items Ethan didn't recognize. A flitter hovered nearby, and more was spread across the field. Guardians were loading the injured onto them. First they pressed a jet injector against Cariad's neck. Immediately, her body relaxed and her eyes half closed. Then they carefully turned her onto her back, while one of them held her head, keeping her as straight as possible on the uneven surface. They slipped some kind of collar around her head, neck, and back, and lifted her onto the board. Ethan helped the Guardians carry Cariad down to the flitter.
"Where are you taking her?" "Back to the Nova Fortuna,"
Strongquist replied.
"Her back or neck may be broken, and the settlement's medical facilities aren't equipped to deal with an injury of that severity. We can assist with her treatment aboard the ship."
Ethan wanted to go with Cariad, but he also wanted to remain to help search for more survivors. The scene was still in chaos. The leader was missing, and no one else seemed to be organizing a response to the emergency.
"Can you please send me word as soon as you know anything about her condition?"
"Of course," Strongquist replied.
"Don't forget to have someone check you over and fix that cut."
With those words, the Guardians sped away on the flitter with Cariad. Ethan turned to face the pandemonium. He went to the nearest group of bystanders who seemed to have been frozen into immobility and gave them instructions for organizing others who were also doing nothing, forming them into rescue teams. He also told them to find people with medical experience and send them to him. They needed to divide the destroyed portion of seating into sections, and they could take it apart piece by piece, shoring up unstable parts. They would find everyone who was trapped. He realized he was still only using one eye because the other was covered in blood. He took off his shirt and ripped off the sleeve. He tried to wipe the blood from his eye so he could see out of it, but it was too crusted up. Instead, he cleaned his face as well as he could, though his cut continued to weep fresh blood. Then he tied his shirt sleeve over his eye. A gen ran up to him, panting. "I'm a medic. Where should I go first?" It was going to be a long, heartbreaking afternoon. When Ethan woke up the next morning, the whole left side of his face ached. He reached up to touch the gauze covering his cut and the healing gel the settlement doctor had applied. He seemed to be the first to wake in the dorm of 20 men. Instinctively, he lifted his lapel to check his comm button for messages, then remembered he was planet-side and the comm network wasn't set up yet. The colonists were using stationary interfaces. There was one in the dorm, and the previous evening when he'd checked it, there hadn't been any messages from Strongquist. He got up and weaved through the sleeping men to check the screen by the door again. A message had finally come. It was short. Strongquist only stated that Cariad had a broken arm and was heavily concussed. She should make a full recovery in 2 or 3 days. He exhaled in relief and rested his forehead on the wall beside the screen. After a moment, he lifted his head again to check the general news. 14 people had died in the explosion. 13 gens, including the leader, and 1 woken. 32 people had been seriously injured. No one had claimed responsibility for the bomb, but the natural movement was suspected. The Guardians were investigating the cause of the explosion and hoped to find evidence that would lead them to the bomber. The Guardians were coming to their rescue again. He couldn't imagine what they would do without these late arrivals from Earth and their advanced tech. He hoped they would catch the saboteurs before they killed or hurt anyone else. The other men in the dorm had begun to stir and wake. Like him, they were all farmers, or rather, they were going to be farmers. He hadn't had much success at school, so not many professions were open to him. Farming had seemed as good as anything else when the time came to choose, but he'd never been content with his decision. He would be confined to his farm most of the time. His crops would need a watchful eye to guard against pests, diseases, drought, and any of the other hundreds of things that could affect them. On the other hand, the colony needed farmers. The colonists were relying on the success of the farms to survive. If their buildings leaked or their children didn't learn much from their teachers, they could live with it. But they couldn't live without food. Yet for as long as he could remember, from when he'd first understood the purpose for which he'd been born, he had always nurtured a secret desire to explore the new planet. But that role was strictly off the cards for Jens. It was written in the manual. Aside from venturing a day or two from the main settlement, exploring wasn't allowed. The new settlers couldn't afford to risk their lives on adventures, and that stricture had been cemented after the first night attack. Even with all the supplies they had brought, the colony wouldn't last longer than 5 or 6 years if they couldn't make it self-sustaining, and that would require the utmost effort from everyone. "That's a beauty," remarked another farmer, Misha, as he passed Ethan on the way to the showers, gesturing toward Ethan's face. Ethan followed along to check his reflection in a mirror and found a black and purple bloom surrounding his eye. "What's happening about the explosion?" Misha asked as he entered a shower. "Did you hear anything?" "The Guardians cordoned off the area once everyone was out. They're going through the wreckage, looking for evidence. I haven't heard any more than that." He stripped, stepped into another cubicle and began to wash, carefully avoiding exposing the gel on his face to water. His skin crawled at the thought that whoever had planted the bomb was living among them, pretending to be the same as everyone else, working toward the colony's success while secretly plotting its downfall. The saboteur could even be Misha. He shook the thought from his head. Suspecting everyone of belonging to the natural movement would be playing right into the terrorists' hands. The only bright side to the situation was the fact that the bomber hadn't been able to create a bomb large enough to take out the entire stadium. If they truly wanted to destroy the colony, that would have been the obvious move. For the moment, it seemed they didn't have access to materials to make larger or more deadly explosives. He turned off the shower and turned on the blower, which quickly dried him. After dressing, he ate breakfast before joining the rest of the farmers in the meeting room. The organizer waiting for them wasted little time in getting down to business. "I'm sure what's at the front of all your minds is the explosion at the stadium yesterday. I don't have much news on that, but what I will say is this. Whatever the murderer might think, we're not going to let him or her stop us from building a thriving community. We're going to carry on as normal and not let the bastards stop us, right?" "Damned right," said a voice, and the other farmers joined in with loud agreements. "Let's get on with it then," said the organizer. "I have the land allotments here." He swiped a pad, and a hollow of the settlement and the landscape surrounding it appeared above the desk. Lines cut through the 3D map, marking boundaries. At the center of each block, a name floated. The farmers got up out of their seats and went closer to see their allotments. Some asked to swap with others. Ethan had remained in his seat for a while as the rest crowded around the hollow, but he decided he might as well find out where he was going to spend the rest of his life. He went over and saw he'd been allocated a squarish block that bordered a lake about 7 clicks from town. Well, Cariad said it was pretty. Chapter 3. Cariad woke. She opened her eyes and gasped. Where was she? Then she remembered. She was aboard the Nova Fortuna. She'd made it. She'd survived cryo. The lights above her were bright, blindingly bright, and she closed her eyes against the pain. She tried to move, but her limbs were leaden. She recalled her last memory. She'd thanked the medical team and said goodbye before they put her to sleep. It had been a weird, sad parting after they had cared for her so well while preparing her to be frozen. By the time she woke up, if she woke up, they would all be long dead and buried. The team had been emotional too, though for some of them it was probably because they believed they were euthanizing her. Yet, despite the risks, despite the unproven success of cryonically preserving people for centuries, the chance had been too good to miss. Public opposition to the launching of the Nova Fortuna had grown to fever pitch in the years and months leading up to departure. If she hadn't taken the opportunity, another wasn't likely within her lifetime. As a world-class geneticist involved in the project, accepting her application had been almost a formality. She had familiarized herself with the cryonic preservation process and knew it should work, yet she almost couldn't believe she'd survived. After she'd been made unconscious, her blood was replaced with a non-aqueous, oxygenated solution that would not expand when frozen. External to her body, the solution was circulated and gradually cooled until she grew so cold that her breathing ceased and her heart stopped beating. She had been lowered into a frozen slush that suspended her, avoiding pressure sores from the pooling circulatory fluid. Her body was cooled still further until she was entirely frozen. To all intents and purposes, she had died, along with 199 other scientists, some old friends and acquaintances, a few strangers. She was sealed within an individual chamber aboard ship weeks before departure. She hadn't witnessed the ship leaving Earth orbit, never seen the protesting mobs, never met the first-generation men and women who had embarked knowing they would end their lives in deep space. People who would create and raise children who, before they were even conceived, were sentenced to share the same fate. The long journey was over. She had survived. She opened her eyes again and felt the smooth sheet beneath her. She moved her fingers and toes and tried again to lift an arm. She winced as a bolt of pain shot from the limb. Something seemed to have gone wrong with it. She tried to raise her head and she winced again. She had the mother of all headaches. To one side, out of her field of vision, a door opened and she heard footsteps. "Glad to see you're finally coming around," a voice said. "How are you feeling? You took quite a knock. How's your arm?" She squinted and managed to bring into focus a familiar-looking man in red scrubs, one of the infirmary medics. She thought his name was Alistair. She became very confused. How did she know his name? He was 6 or 7 generations in the future from her perspective. And what did he mean about a knock? Alistair was fiddling with the infuser attached to her inside elbow. "How are the others doing?" she asked, hoping the rest of the scientists had been successfully revived. "There were 14 deaths and 32 injured, I'm sorry to say. You've been out around 50 hours, in case you were wondering." "What?" "Dr. Montford put you into a coma to give your brain a chance to heal from the concussion. We withdrew the sedative a couple of hours ago." "What?" Utterly confused, she tried to sit up to get a better look at her surroundings. Maybe she would see something that would help her make sense of what the medic was saying. Alistair placed a hand on her shoulder. "Just relax for now. You'll be feeling the effects of the sedative a little longer. I've told the doctor you're awake. He'll be along in a moment. After he's checked you over, maybe you can sit up and have something to drink." Now he mentioned it, she realized her throat was dry and sore. as if she'd been sleeping with her mouth open. She gave up trying to move and tried to make sense of what was happening. A memory of an explosion flashed into her mind. She recalled flying through the air, then nothing. She worked back from the explosion. She'd been in a stadium and resigning herself to listening to a boring speech, then everything came flooding back. She'd woken from cryo 2 years previously. The Nova Fortuna had reached her destination. They'd held the arrival day celebration, and after that there had been the first night attack. She gasped again. "Is something wrong?" Alistair asked. "Are you in pain?" "Ethan, is he okay?" Alistair smiled. "He's fine. He pulled you from the wreckage, in fact." As she closed her eyes, Dr. Montfort arrived. After examining her, the doctor said she could sit up. He wanted her to stay in the medical bay another night in case of any after effects of her concussion. Her broken arm would be mended in about a week, and then she could return to work. Montfort paused. "A guardian, Strongquist, has been asking about you. He wants to speak to you about the explosion. I can put him off another few hours if you don't feel up to talking to him, but—" "No, it's fine. I'll speak to him." She had a burning desire to find out who or what was responsible for the disaster. Though she had her reservations about Strongquist, she was willing to put them aside for the sake of a successful investigation. The guardian came into her room. "I'm glad to see you looking so well, Cariad." "Thanks. I'm lucky I didn't suffer worse injuries, but you're even luckier than me. You weren't hurt?" "I have to confess, I'm not one for long speeches. When the explosion occurred, I'd already left the box." "Good timing." "Indeed. I'm sorry for being so impatient to see you, but I want to catch the person or people who did this, and quickly, before they do something else." She sat up higher in bed. "Then it was a bomb?" "I'm afraid so." "The natural movement again." "We can't think of any other explanation." She digested the information dejectedly. After the guardians had apprehended and executed the person responsible for the first night attack, she'd thought the threat to the colony was over. She hadn't imagined there might be more than one natural movement fanatic among them. "Whoever is masterminding these attacks," Strongquist said, "it could be a Woken or a Gen." "It's more likely to be a Gen, don't you think? Though I hate the idea. The person you executed was a Gen." "We aren't ruling out the possibility that it's a Woken. The first night attack saboteur could have been persuaded to turn off the electric fence by someone else. She said she'd acted alone, but she must have been lying. Conversely, she could have been a member of a covert Gen cult that's existed since the Nova Fortuna departed Earth." "You mean like a secret tradition passed down the generations?" "Exactly." "If that's the case, we could be talking about more than 1 or 2 people. We could be talking about tens or hundreds." "I doubt that it's hundreds. If there were so many, it would be difficult to keep their beliefs secret, and they wouldn't be confined to single small acts. They could do something much bigger and more damaging. A few hundred can overwhelm a couple of thousand with a little planning." "But if the natural movement followers are Gens, there could still be quite a few of them." "We already know there's more than one." She sighed. The colonization was going to be hard enough without contending with a secret, subversive faction. "We seem to have lost track somewhere. How can I help you with the investigation?" "Ah, yes. I'm enlisting the help of the Woken because you may remember things from the development of the project that may not have been recorded. We've analyzed the bomb residues, but the chemicals used aren't particularly difficult to acquire. Anyone could have stolen small amounts while we were bringing down the supplies. So we turned our search to historical records, hoping to discover natural movement affiliations among the Woken or the original Gens. But we haven't uncovered anything useful so far."
Then it occurred to me the project scientists are living, talking historical documents. People like you, Cariad, are a source of knowledge and memories. I've been asking all the Woken to watch the news recordings from the protests and read the reports and other documents. Perhaps you'll see a face or read a name you recognize, and you may make a connection. Would you mind going over a few things and telling me of anything that strikes you as possibly relevant, however insignificant or tangential it might seem?
I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
And when I'm up and around again, in a day or so, according to Montfort, I'll help with the investigation too. Strongquist looked less happy about this proposal.
Thank you for offering, but I don't think there's any need.
We can't continue to rely on guardians all the time. We aren't babies, and now my work with the actual babies of the colony is coming to an end. I'll be able to devote some time to ensuring justice for those who were murdered. She gave Strongquist a fixed smile. The guardian didn't buckle under her gaze, but he seemed to concede the fight wasn't one he was going to win.
As you wish. I've sent links to the relevant files to your account.
He rose to leave. I want to thank you for everything you and your colleagues have done for the colony, Strongquist. It isn't that I don't appreciate it. I just think the sooner we learn to stand on our own 2 feet, the better.
I understand perfectly.
He nodded to her and left. She reached for an interface with her broken arm, winced and swapped to the other arm. She pulled the screen in front of her and swiped it open. Strongquist's list was at the top of a string of messages from friends wishing her well. She opened the first of the Guardian's links, a VidNews report. She checked the date. It was the day the Nova had begun her maneuvers to break free of Earth orbit. The official departure date. By that time, she had already been frozen in slush for several weeks, and she'd missed the response of Earth's population to the ship's departure. It was quite the reaction. The recording showed massive crowds in the world's capitals and major cities. Protesting millions surged through the streets of Beijing, Washington, Moscow, London, Cape Town, Nairobi, New York, Sydney, Mumbai and Buenos Aires. Her hand rose to her mouth as she watched the rioting, fires, water cannons and the effects of exploding nerve gas canisters. Leading up to the final preparations, she'd been aware of the growing popularity of the natural movement, but she'd been working around the clock and hadn't followed current affairs closely. She also hadn't been very interested in them. As a scientist, the movement's objections to deep space colonization had been hard for her to understand. She would have better understood an angry reaction to the fact that so few were able to come along. What was she supposed to be looking for? Did Strongquist expect she might see something significant in the mobs? After witnessing a particularly violent confrontation, she gave a shudder and silent thanks that the Nova Fortuna had been built in space, out of the reach of natural movement followers. They would probably have tried to blow up the ship. The next link led to an interview with some natural movement leaders at a protest. She leaned closer. Here was something that might yield useful information. She scanned the faces in the background. Prominent figures wouldn't have been so foolish as to try to infiltrate the colonization project, but individuals behind the scenes had a greater degree of anonymity. Yet no one looked even remotely familiar. The scene shifted to a studio interview, and her heart skipped a beat. What had moved her wasn't any of the debaters, natural movement leaders and politicians with global influence, but the large image projected behind them. It was the portrait of a scientist. Though she looked younger in the photograph than Cariad remembered her, she recognized the woman right away. It was Dr. Crowley, the first victim of the first night attack. Poor Meredith. Always so warm-hearted, so ready to see good in others, so trusting, too trusting as it turned out. Cariad had warned her friend that the project's ambition of creating a society free of violence was too lofty, that human aggression was innate and not a product of social conditioning. She would have given anything to have been wrong and have Meredith back again. Sickened by the brutality of the riot scenes and the anger from the natural movement leaders, she closed the recording and opened another of Strongquist's links. It was a list of members of the subversive society. The Guardian had attached a note explaining that, in her time, the document hadn't been in the possession of authorities. It was a secret list, uncovered by historians centuries later. He wanted to know if any of the names meant anything. She scanned it. The names numbered in the thousands. For several minutes she saw nothing familiar. She yawned. After the surge of adrenaline when she woke up, her injuries were catching up with her. She drank some water to help her stay awake, but her mind drifted. 184 years had passed while she'd been in cryonic suspension, but she had only lived through 2 years since her revival. Yet her time on Earth seemed a lifetime away. Memories she'd previously suppressed began to surface. Memories of saying goodbye to her parents and sisters, knowing she would never see them again. Recollections of the sharp sting of guilt at the stoicism on her family's faces. Their parting was something she would never forget. Effectively, in her terms and theirs, they had all died at that moment. She wiped away a tear with the heel of her hand. Her family, friends and acquaintances had all passed away while she'd been in suspension, and by the time she was revived they were turned to dust and long forgotten by everyone but her. She swallowed, trying to force down the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. But it was no use. For the first time since she'd been brought back to life 2 years ago, she gave in to the grief and sorrow she had been denying for so long. It was some time before her feelings softened and she returned to browsing the lists of natural movement members. Almost immediately, a name caught her eye: Frederick Aparicio. She frowned. She wasn't sure why the name was familiar. She couldn't place him in her memories of everyone she'd known on Earth. Yet she knew the name, unless her mind was playing tricks on her. She opened her personal files of vids, mails, and images from her previous life. She rarely dared to look at them, but perhaps because she'd vented her feelings, viewing the files didn't upset her as much as she'd feared. In fact, it gave her pleasure to remember all the people she'd left behind and read their messages. She searched all the files for the name Frederick Aparicio, but she turned up a blank. She was puzzling at the problem, deep in concentration, when a new mail arrived. It was from Ethan.
"Heard you're awake and feeling better. I'm glad to hear it. I'm going to see my farm tomorrow. Do you want to come along?"
Chapter 4. Ethan waited for Cariad in the lot outside the shuttle station. A regular shuttle schedule of 3 arrivals and departures per day had begun to run, and Cariad had come to say she would be on the noon arrival. He had watched the shuttle fly in, appearing from out of the sky as if by magic. To him the Nova was now no more than a stationary point of light at night, and in the daytime the starship was entirely invisible. As a Gen, he now required special permission to return to his old home. The new rule rankled, especially because Woken like Cariad could come and go as they pleased. The reason given was that the Woken's roles were mostly scientific and performed aboard the starship, while Ethan's and other Gens' jobs were confined to the settlement or nearby. Yet the delineation was clear. The Woken had freedom to travel to and from the ship, and the Gens did not. The planet-side dwellers had quietly pushed back by taking control of the flitters. The ship had brought 30 of the fusion-powered land vehicles to the New World. They would run for around 3 years before their energy ran out, and the technology to refuel or replace them was unlikely to have been developed by that time. Consequently, the manual stated they must only be used when absolutely necessary, such as for emergencies and transportation of materials or equipment too heavy to be moved by any other method. The gens had taken it upon themselves to bend the parameters of what constituted absolute necessity by routinely using the flitters on trips outside the settlement. Massive road-making machines were already crawling slowly across the landscape, and solar-powered electric vehicles were being assembled from kits, but were not ready yet. The gens were nervous about venturing into the wild with no means of escape from predatory organisms other than their own 2 feet. Also, they had quickly picked up on how convenient it was to ride a flitter. After growing up aboard a starship with transit cars, they weren't used to walking long distances. Ethan was looking forward to taking Cariad for a ride. He'd packed some food so they wouldn't have to return to the settlement to eat when they got hungry. Shuttle passengers began to emerge from the station exit, and he smiled as he saw Cariad's familiar figure among them. She spotted him seated in the flitter and waved. "Hi," she said as she approached. "How did you get permission to take one of these? I thought we were hiking there. I wore my walking boots." "It's a little too far to walk. Besides, all the farmers have use of the flitters." Cariad's eyebrows lifted. "All the farmers? But aren't you supposed to be—" "Saving them for emergencies? Strictly speaking, yes. But the roads aren't ready yet, so that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Also, though the creatures from the first night attack are nocturnal, there's always a chance something else might take an interest." "Have other life forms been spotted?" "Not yet. Xenobiologists have combed the farming districts, but they didn't find anything. We put up an electric fence around the farms anyway, just in case." Cariad opened the flitter door and climbed in. There were seats for 6, but the rear 4 were folded down to make room for a load. The flitter briefly dipped under the extra weight, then returned to its former elevation. "What happened to your face?" Cariad asked when she saw him close up. He had forgotten they hadn't seen each other since the bombing. She probably didn't remember being rescued. "Just an injury from the explosion. The scar's fading now. How's your arm?" "It's getting better. The doctor said just another few days and it'll be good as new." "And your head?" "It's fine. I heard you pulled me from the wreckage. I wanted to thank you." "You don't have to thank me. Anyone would have done it." "I know, but—" She drifted to silence, apparently unsure how to frame what she wanted to say. "It's good to be planetside again. I always feel a little claustrophobic aboard ship, even though it's as big as a town. There's something weird about living in an entirely artificial environment. I've never quite gotten used to it." "I never minded it. Living aboard the Nova was all I knew before we came here. In fact, the first time I came planetside, I was nervous. The idea that I could walk for years and never walk in the same place twice freaked me out, though I wouldn't admit it to Lauren." Cariad's expression turned sympathetic, but the atmosphere between them became awkward. He wondered if it was the first time he had mentioned Lauren in front of her. He couldn't remember. Thinking about Lauren since she passed was almost unbearably painful. Maybe he hadn't talked about her up until now. "It's about time we left," he said, starting up the flitter. He reversed the machine from the curb and pulled out of the lot. Once they were through the gate in the electric fence, he set the flitter to automatic. Cariad gave a surprised, "Oh!" as it left the road before setting off through the fern-like trees surrounding the settlement. He chuckled. "We're heading directly to my land. The flitter doesn't pay much attention to roads. When you're floating 30 centimeters high, there's no need for them." "I would have thought there would be some need for them."
Nope. Flitters go around anything in the way, moving or not, or they rise up and pass over. They're very safe. You never went on one back on Earth?
I didn't. They were entirely new technology. Anti-gravity propulsion had only just been invented, and the engineers had barely run all the safety tests on flitters before they were loaded onto the ship. I hadn't even seen one in real life, only in vids. I remember the FDL Starship engineers had hopes that AGRAV would lead them to a breakthrough, but that hadn't happened by the time we left.
This is really your first time in a flitter?
A wave of delight washed over him. He'd always seen Cariad as smarter and more experienced than he was. He'd never thought he would be more accomplished at something than her. What are you thinking?
Nothing much. Why?
You have a goofy grin on your face.
I do?
Is it because I said it was my first time in a flitter?
No. Yeah, actually. I didn't think I'd ever have more experience in something than a woken. You always seem to know everything and have done everything. Being around you makes most of us gens feel stupid, if I'm honest.
Her expression fell, and she turned to look out at the passing landscape.
Is something wrong? I didn't mean anything by what I said. I was only talking about what it's like being a gen. I wasn't criticizing you.
When she turned back to Ethan, her face remained sad. Is that how you see me? Is that what I am to you? Awoken?
No, I didn't mean it like that. I was only talking generally. I don't think of you as just another woken. You're a friend, Cariad, a good friend.
She appeared to feel a little happier. You're a friend too. I don't think of you as a gen. She returned her gaze to outside the flitter. They had left the forested area surrounding the settlement and were travelling across an open plain where the rubbery ground cover grew waist-high. The flitter adjusted its height accordingly. On the horizon lay a thin blue line, the lake that bordered Ethan's land. He stole another look at his companion. She seemed to have gotten over the downturn in her mood. He recalled seeing her in the first night attack, carrying a flaming brand in each hand, the light of the torches flickering across her features. The image had remained in his mind and probably would forever. I think I can see it, she said. That's the lake, right? Is your land on this side of it?
Yes, it is. Of all the allotments, mine is farthest from town. The land on the other side of the lake doesn't belong to anyone yet.
Yes, it does. It belongs to everyone, Cariad said with a smile.
Yeah, that's right. Until it's allocated.
Maybe if your farm does well, they'll give you the land on the other side too. You could have a huge place.
I guess so.
Wouldn't you like that? The only other person he had told about his dissatisfaction with the idea of becoming a farmer was Dr. Crowley, his other woken friend. She had died that terrible first night of the settlement. The profession allocation system was intended to be flexible within the parameters set by academic achievement, strengths, and temperament. But refusing to choose any of the positions offered to you upon high school graduation was seen to be antisocial. He was only going to be a farmer because he didn't really have a choice. He thought he would have done something quite different. He realized he hadn't replied to her question.
I'm not very enthusiastic about farming. If I could choose, I'd rather explore this new world. I used to read a lot when I was a kid. Mostly when I should have been doing my homework. I read about the great explorers of the 18th and 19th centuries on Earth. They would go places where no human had ever set foot, like the South Pole. Then fewer and fewer of those places existed. Later on, people went to the summits of the highest mountains and deep into ocean trenches. They went to all the places on Earth where it used to be too hard for people to survive. They went to the moon. Then, by the 22nd century, there wasn't even anywhere on the colonized solar planets that someone hadn't explored. But this place, We hardly know anything about it. We only have information from probes to tell us what's here, and we found out on the first night that information isn't reliable. We need to know more about this planet. I want to find out more, but I'm going to be stuck here digging the ground and growing crops for the rest of my life." His voice had risen. He paused and gave a wry smile. "Sorry, I guess I needed to vent." They had passed through the gate in the fence surrounding the farming district. Cariad looked out at the approaching lake in silence for a little while. Then she said, "You know, you're right. What if there's some other menace out there that could destroy us? We need to know about it. If we don't, how can we defend ourselves? We're lucky that the electric fence seems to keep everything dangerous out of the settlement. What would we do if there's a life form that isn't affected by electricity? We need people like you to find out what the dangers are." "I'd love to do that, but I don't see anyone giving the order any time soon." A new leader had yet to be elected after the bombing, and a date for a new naming ceremony hadn't been set. "We're nearly there. We might already be on my land, in fact. It isn't easy to tell without boundary markers, but I think this is it." The lake stretched out in front of them. If he had to be a farmer, he counted himself lucky to have such a useful resource on his doorstep, though water channels to other farms would cut across his land. Maybe the lake contained something like fish, too, something that humans could eat. He stopped the flitter a short distance from the shore, and they got out. The ground was spongy, and their footsteps left imprints as they walked across it, wading through the vegetation. Together they went toward the stretch of water. "I wanted to ask you, is this planet very different from Earth?" She thought a while before replying. "At first look, it isn't. The sky's blue, the vegetation is green, there are mountains and oceans, rocks and soil, and the gravity is nearly the same. That was the main reason this place was chosen. Once the colonists arrived, they would be on their own. No request for help would even reach Earth until it was way too late. So we couldn't commit to a colonization except on a world where conditions were as near perfect as possible. But now that I'm here, it's different in so many ways. The plants look weird. The air smells funny. The sunlight isn't quite right. And of course, the night sky is totally different. And the sounds? Can you hear anything?" "Only the noise of the wind." "On Earth, if we were out in the countryside, we would hear birds and insects, maybe frogs and other animals, depending on the time of day. This planet is almost entirely silent. If I don't think about it, I don't notice, but I guess I feel it on another level. Nothing is quite right about this place. I don't dislike it, but I seem to be always a little bit aware that I'm somewhere different." A warm, humid breeze came toward them from across the lake. The sun was still high. Its rays blazed across the water surface, creating a silver sheen on the smooth expanse. They reached the lake's edge, where the vegetation gave way to black sand. Lazy ripples lapped at the shore. They were alone in the alien landscape. "What do you think?" Ethan asked. "It's beautiful." Chapter 5. Cariad squatted down next to a gestation bag. 5 trainee midwives stood in a half-circle behind her. So far, none of them had volunteered to assist with a decanting. There really isn't anything to be frightened of, you know. Isn't anyone willing to try? I know it seems scary, but the chances of losing a baby are vanishingly small. I don't think a single one has been lost at the decanting stage. It's much safer than natural childbirth. We can see if the baby's stuck or the umbilicus is wrapped around its neck or it's past meconium. We don't have to rely on instruments to tell us what's happening. Things are going to be a lot harder planet-side when you're assisting women giving birth. She shut her eyes.
That was exactly the last thing she should have said. She was supposed to be reassuring these young men and women, not making them nervous. When she opened her eyes, however, a fresh-faced man had raised his hand. "Great! Step over here."
"Oh, the man mumbled. "I just wanted to ask a question."
Deflated, she said, "Shoot."
"I was wondering why you don't just open up the bags and take the babies out. Wouldn't that be a lot safer and easier?"
Good question. So it might seem easier to do it that way, but when the babies are squeezed out through the decanting channel, the action forces mucus out of their lungs and respiratory tract, and that helps them breathe. There might be other unknown benefits too. We try to mimic nature as much as possible because sometimes we can only guess why humans evolved to reproduce the way we do. That's why we play the audio of a pregnant woman's heartbeat to the babies from the embryo stage onwards. Without it or other sounds, their hearing might not develop normally. We can't be sure because it would be unethical to conduct an experiment to find out, so we take the precaution of exposing them to noise. On the other hand, in the artificial method, we've removed the known risks of natural childbirth, like a too narrow birth canal. "Is natural childbirth really risky?" asked a frightened-eyed young woman. Cariad couldn't tell if the trainee was asking in a professional or personal capacity. "It's riskier, I can't deny it. Unfortunately, the reproductive technology that served us on the ship won't last forever. It's already wearing out. We need to move reproduction planet-side and increase the birth rate, which means that after this final decanting, it's down to you gens to do things the old-fashioned way. But the settlement hospital will be equipped with birthing facilities of the best quality. And those facilities are going to be staffed with the best midwives, right?" It was an unfortunate consequence of the impersonal replenishing of the gen population that none of them had any experience of natural pregnancies or births. Up until now, reproductive technicians had been responsible for creating and gestating the project's new babies. Working alongside the settlement doctors, the people she was training would be dealing with soon-to-be new mothers who would probably be frightened, if not terrified. What was more, the women might also have a higher risk of complications. For 6 generations, women hadn't had to give birth naturally. Still, Cariad tried to give the students her most encouraging smile. It seemed to do the trick. The man who had first asked a question stepped forward. "I'll try." "Fantastic! Come over here. You saw what I did, right? Make sure you have everything ready before you open the channel. I'm going to watch, but I won't intervene unless I see you need some help, okay?" When she had studied human reproductive biology, she only assisted with a decanting a few times in preparation for taking her finals. Students were supposed to experience the practical nitty-gritty of their subject. Later on, as a reproductive geneticist, she hadn't been expected to actually decant babies. That was a job for technicians. Since being revived from cryonic suspension, however, she had enjoyed bringing the little squirming, mewling infants into the world. She hoped she could pass on that enjoyment to these men and women. She moved out of the trainee's way as he prepared the receiving dish and checked the emergency equipment. The baby he was about to decant was one of the less active ones. The female infant hung upside down in her gestation bag, her eyes closed, a serene expression on her tiny face, entirely unaware that her life was about to begin. The man paused and half-turned toward Cariad for reassurance. "You're ready to go." He activated the decant function on the panel. Pulsations began to ripple the surface of the bag, and fluid dripped from the channel as, slowly, it opened. The student squatted as Cariad had and held his hands beneath the opening. It was a precaution in case a malfunction or a particularly wriggly infant caused the exit to suddenly burst wide. Now he'd found the courage to try, the man was doing well. Time wore on, and the gestation bag pushed the baby girl into the narrow, flexible channel at its base. The trainee was beginning to look uncomfortable, probably due to squatting for so long. "You can kneel if you want," she told him. "It won't be long now." The receiving dish gurgled as the fluid dripping from the bag was drained away. The trainee midwives leaned closer. The moment of decanting was approaching. The baby was packed into a ball, her small chubby arms wrapped up high around her chest. She gave a wriggle and the channel opened wider, spilling a gush of fluid into the dish below. "Nearly there," Cariad said to the kneeling student. "Get ready." He held his gloved hands beneath the baby's crowning head. Pink liquid soaked his hands and wrists. The top of the baby's head appeared. Centimetre by centimetre, the head emerged from the channel. A small face came next, its eyes still closed. Then a tiny fist showed up, followed by one round shoulder, then another. As the baby slid out of the collapsing bag, the man carefully took the weight of her head and body. He gently lay her down in the receiving dish. She took her first breath, and a pink colour suffused her skin. "Do you remember the procedure for the placenta?" Cariad said. The trainee nodded without turning around, apparently unable to take his eyes from the baby, who gently waved her arms and legs, testing out her newfound freedom. She grimaced, and her deep blue, unfocused eyes briefly peeked out from between their eyelids. When the placenta was ejected from the gestation bag, the trainee cut the umbilicus and picked up the baby to swaddle her. He turned around, his face wreathed in a beaming smile. "I did it!" "You certainly did. Do you want to take her to the nursery?" The baby was breathing well and didn't seem to have any problems, but the duty doctor would check her over thoroughly. "Sure. Do you think they'll let me name her?" Cariad chuckled. "Maybe. It won't hurt to ask." Like a proud new father, the man carried the newborn out of the gestation room. Cariad turned to the waiting students. "Who's next?" By the end of the session, each trainee had taken a turn at decanting a newborn, and Cariad finished the training a little less worried than she'd been when it started. Though the gens still had a long way to go to restart natural human reproduction on a scale that would increase the population, it seemed they could at least lose some of their fear of it. Dr. Montford would take over the students' preparation for the real thing, with natural childbirth vids and whatever else he had in mind. When the last of the trainees had left, she took a final look at the gestation room with its empty gestation bags, some still dripping. For nearly 2 centuries, the reproductive facilities had served the Nova Fortuna project well, steadily maintaining a heterogeneous gene pool of 2,000 individuals. But its days were finally over. Cleaning up the room and putting everything into storage could wait until tomorrow. It had been a long day. She turned off the heartbeat soundtrack and the lights and left. As she walked out, she bumped into someone on her way in. It was Anahi, an agricultural scientist and awoken. When she had been revived from cryo, the process had left her blind. The Nova wasn't equipped with the technology to grow new eyes and optic nerves, so she relied on a vision aid, a black strip of light-sensitive material wrapped around her head and connected with her brain through a contact at the back. The crueler gens, unused to seeing anyone who deviated from standard human physiology, made jokes about Anahi within her hearing. They said she had eyes in the back of her head and made other crass comments. In fact, Anahi did have better than normal peripheral vision and could probably see a wider colour range. However, Cariad imagined she would probably rather have had real eyes. Cariad had gotten to know the fellow scientist over the years they'd both been working on the project preparations, and though the older woman was likeable enough, Cariad had found her to be rather brittle and not the type to take the Gen's teasing in good humour. She must have barely met the psychological standard to be allowed to join the cryosuspended contingent of the colonists. "Did the decanting go well?" Anahi asked. "Yes, thanks. 50 new babies added to the gene pool, all healthy and normal." "Good. So that's it then. The last gens conceived and gestated artificially." "I hope so. They're on their own for the time being anyway. In the case of a disaster, we can always open up the shop again. You still have plenty of frozen eggs and sperm, haven't you? And how's the equipment? Has it held up well? I remember you were concerned about that." "It's still functioning adequately. I haven't encountered any failures. Have you in your section?" "No, but everything's looking tired and old, rather like me." Anahi smiled. "I'm sure you have quite a few more decades in you." "Thanks, but I wasn't fishing for compliments. I wanted to speak to you about something." "What's that?" "Well, first of all, I want to say the generational colonists have done quite well in getting this far. Do you remember when we were placed in cryo? We thought we might never be revived, or that only 1 or 2 of the ancient descendants of the first generation would be alive at the journey's end. Yet we woke up and it seemed everything had worked like clockwork. 2,000 healthy colonists with a good genetic mix. They'd followed the manual almost to the letter in that regard." She paused. "But," Cariad raised her eyebrows, "there is something, I'm not sure how to put it. The generational colonists, they're kind of childlike. They don't have much initiative, much get up and go, if you know what I mean. They just mindlessly do things without really thinking." "I'm not sure I understand you." "For example, the first night attack. I wasn't there, thank goodness, but I heard almost everyone ran around like panicked sheep. I heard that if it wasn't for you, they would all have been killed." "You heard wrong then. I helped, yes, but it was Ethan, a Gen, who saved the day. And the attack was terrifying. It isn't surprising the Gens reacted as they did. I was pretty close to running around like a panicked sheep myself. I don't think you'd be so quick to criticize if you'd been there." Cariad wondered where Anahi was heading. Something was clearly bugging her. "Still," Cariad said nothing, waiting for the other woman to speak her mind. "Cariad, I think we need to resume the revival process. We need more project scientists to oversee the colonization. If we don't, we risk the entire project failing." "But Anahi..." "What? Do I have to spell it out? You're one of the last people I would expect to make that suggestion. You lost your sight, others lost the use of their limbs, and some are permanently brain damaged. Some didn't even make it. Everyone we revive is at risk of serious complications or death. And anyway, I don't agree with you about the Gens. They're entirely capable of making a go of this. They might seem naive and inexperienced to us, but they were raised in an unnatural environment. They can adapt and meet the challenges of living on the planet. I'm sure of it. They're human, the same as us. Adapting is what humans do best." Anahi seemed pensive. "I thought you might say that." "Huh? You thought I might say what?" "Never mind. Look, I get it that you like the generational colonists. I like them too. I just don't think they're equipped for this job we've set them. And it isn't their fault. It's our fault for imagining they ever could be. Hell, it would be hard enough to colonize an alien planet, even for us. people experienced in living in a planetary environment and not coddled all our lives aboard a starship. I think it's time to admit we were wrong. It would have been better to freeze 2,000 individuals and maintain a much smaller population of living crew, just enough to look after the ship and begin the reviving process. That can't be helped now, but we do need more project scientists. We need their skills and their experience of living in a natural environment. Seriously? Do you really think we need more people from Earth so badly we should risk their lives? If we don't wake them up, they're as good as dead. Don't you think we should give them a chance of life? We need more time to understand what went wrong. How long do you think we should wait? The last I heard, we'd made hardly any progress in understanding why some of us were revived with no problems and others died. For all we know, it could be something to do with the way we were frozen, and there isn't anything we can do about that now. At least this way the question is decided, one way or another. Cariad hesitated to answer. She felt that Anahi was wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on why. Her argument seemed rational. If only the cryo-organisers had thought to provide for this eventuality. All the Woken had written wills about life-saving measures if something went wrong during revival. But no one had been asked to state whether they should be revived. That was a given. Think about it. I'm going to speak to some of the others and see if we can come to a consensus. I'm not going to do anything if most of us think it's too risky. But personally speaking, I would rather be blind and living and breathing than lying frozen in sludge, possibly forever. And the generational colonists need more of us if the colonization is to stand a chance of succeeding. But even if the other Woken agree, you have to get the permission of the leader to restart the revival process. There is no leader, and even if there were, why do we need his or her permission? We were the ones who organised the project. We were there at the beginning, and we know what's needed for it to succeed. The others only exist because of us. Cariad was becoming increasingly annoyed at Anahi's reasoning and opinions, and it clearly showed on her face. The woman touched her arm in a conciliatory manner. I just want to help the gens, as you call them, for their benefit and our own. And to do that, we need strength in numbers. We need more of us. Cariad was about to reply when Stromquist appeared. She didn't want to continue the discussion in front of the Guardian. It felt like washing the Woken's dirty laundry in public, and she didn't quite trust the man.
I thought I'd find you here, Stromquist said to Cariad. I wanted to ask you something, if you have a moment.
Anahi gave Cariad's arm a squeeze and said, "Think about it," again before leaving. "What is it?" Cariad asked Stromquist, still irritated by her conversation with Anahi.
I was wondering if you'd gotten any further with checking the resources I gave you. Did you find anything that might lead us to the stadium bomber?
No. I checked everything through, but I didn't see anything that'll help. Stromquist peered at her.
You seem hesitant. Do you mean you didn't see anything, or you saw something, but you aren't sure how it might be useful?
She frowned. The latter. There was a name that seemed meaningful, but I looked through all my records and I couldn't see anything that would link me to the person. I think it's just my imagination running wild.
Maybe this person didn't have anything to do with you, but the name is familiar due to an event or encounter that you can't remember just yet. Don't forget that you were in cryonic suspension for nearly 2 centuries. It wouldn't be surprising if you experienced some memory loss. What was the name?
It wasn't difficult for Cariad to recall. The name had been on her mind so much while she'd tried to figure out its significance. It was burned in. Frederick Aparicio.
I'll check it out and see what I can find.
Are you any closer to catching the bomber? Asking the Guardian the question felt weird. It was as if they were the colony's police force, yet no one had appointed them.
I'm sorry, we aren't much further on, but maybe this name will help. I'll let you know if we discover anything.
Thanks, I appreciate it, Cariad replied, wishing she knew what she could do herself to find the culprit. Chapter 6. It was Ethan's turn with the plough. 5 of the machines had been assembled from kits brought aboard the Nova. There were plenty more waiting to be put together, but the first crop was a priority. The farmers were sharing the use of the available ploughs. The machine was mechanical only. It had no computer controlling it or refining its operation according to variations in soil, plants, or the weather, as agricultural technology on Earth had. The farmers would have to learn all the nuances of their job and not rely on support from tech, passing their knowledge and skills down to the next generation. Computers required complex parts, and those complex parts required rare, refined resources. Until the colony progressed to a level capable of providing those resources, it would rely on human ingenuity. Ethan stared at the instruction manual, then at the plough, and then at the manual again. The farmer who had brought the plough over had explained its operation. It had seemed straightforward while he was listening, but Ethan was having problems matching his memory of the farmer's words with the machine in front of him. His difficulties probably had something to do with the fact that he had no interest whatsoever in operating it. Heaving a sigh, he approached the machine. Maybe he could learn to work it by trial and error. There wasn't anything around for him to collide with, so he wasn't likely to do any harm. He didn't even have a house yet. He rolled the plaspaper document and pushed it into his back pocket before grabbing the bars on either side of the cab door and pulling himself up and in. He sat in the driver's seat and stared at the controls. They seemed simple enough. Some steered the machine and others operated the plough. "Hey!" called a voice. He nearly jumped out of his skin. A short woman was standing right next to the cab, squinting up at him from under a cap, her hands on her hips. "I didn't mean to startle you. I guess you didn't hear me arrive." A flitter rested on the ground behind her. "I'm your neighbour. Name's Cherry." She held up her hand. He leaned down and shook it.
"Ethan, but I thought my neighbour was."
"He got reassigned. I took over his land. Always wanted to be a farmer, and here I am. Can I join you up there? I think I'm next in line for this plough. Thought I'd get a handle on it."
"Sure."
With some difficulty, due to her shortness, Cherry climbed up into the passenger side of the cab. "Have you figured it out yet?"
"Honestly, no. I was just about to start it up and take it from there."
"Sounds like a good idea. Do you have the instructions? Can I take a look?" He pulled the thin book out of his pocket and gave it to her. Then he pressed a button. Their engine started. "Doing good so far," said Cherry, not looking up from the manual. He couldn't tell if she was being sarcastic. He had finally recognized her. Cherry had been 2 grades above him at school. Then he remembered something else that made him pause. "Aren't you going to start driving it? You should go to a corner of your land and begin there."
"Wait a minute. I'm just trying to figure out what you're doing here. Why are you a farmer? You were top of your grade in math and science."
She rolled her eyes. "Just because I was good at something doesn't mean I have to like it. I didn't want to do any of the jobs my grade average qualified me for. I wanted to be a farmer. I can't think of anything else I'd rather do."
"So they let you change jobs, just like that?"
"Not exactly just like that, but it wasn't too hard. Things are in disarray at the moment with no leader. I think they just got tired of arguing with me in the end and gave me permission to take over the land after it became vacant. They only wanted me to go away and stop bothering them."
"Really?"
"Yep. So, are you going to drive this thing or not?"
Do you want to try?"
"I'd love to." He jumped out of the cab and walked around the plough before climbing into the seat Cherry had vacated. She turned her cap around so the bill faced backward and, giving him a grin, pressed the accelerator. The plough lurched violently forward. He grabbed the side of the cab to prevent himself from being thrown out. "Sorry." He slid his door closed and she did the same. Then she set off. As they drove along, the rough ground bounced them up and down and threw them from side to side. She began to laugh, and he joined in. "Where do I go?" He turned and pointed to the side of the lake where his land bordered the shore. It was as good a place to start as any. She swung the plough around so hard it was in danger of toppling over. He held on tight. "Whoops!" "Take it easy. What's your hurry? We have all day." "I know." She stopped the plough at the edge of the lake where the vegetation gave way to the shore. Her expression turned more serious. "But it would be great if I could plough and sow my own land soon. The sooner this colony is self-sustaining, the better." "I don't think anyone would disagree with you on that. But let's face it, none of us knows what we're doing. This is an expensive item of equipment we can't replace. It might be good to take things slowly, step by step." Her look darkened further. "You mean none of us gens know what we're doing?" "I guess I do mean that. We grew up aboard the ship, while the Woken and the Guardians—" "Don't say it!" "Don't say what?" "You were about to say they're more experienced than us, better than us, just because they grew up on Earth." "Something like that. The Woken went to college. They worked hard to become the world's top scientists. They didn't have everything provided for them like us, and they know how to handle living planet-side." "And I suppose you think that makes them better than us?" "It depends what you—" "I can't believe I'd hear an opinion like that from you, Ethan. Everyone likes you so much because you helped save people in the first night attack. But if the others heard what you've just said—" "What did I say?" He'd only stated the obvious. "I didn't say anything bad about gens. I don't think there's anything wrong with us. But we're different from the Woken and the Guardians. There's no denying it." "And there I was, thinking of asking you." Cherry shook her head. "Asking me what?" When she refused to answer, he said, "Wait a minute. You aren't really here because you wanted to help me with the ploughing, are you?" "Yes, I am." "I don't think so. It doesn't make any sense that someone as smart as you would want to become a farmer. Why are you really here?" She wasn't meeting his gaze. "I do want to be a farmer, but don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. I think I'd better go. I'll walk back to my flitter. Bring the plough over when you've finished with it, okay?" Before he had a chance to reply, she jumped down from the cab and set off along the shoreline. His brow knitted in confusion, he slid over to the driver's seat and took the manual out of his back pocket to study it again. The engine was humming, and he only just heard another sound over it, something like a gasp and a thud. He checked over his shoulder to locate the source. A mass of thin, writhing threads from the lake had Cherry by her ankles. She was on her stomach being dragged into the water. Her mouth gaped in a soundless scream. He leapt down and was at her side in moments. Grabbing her arms, he pulled as hard as he could. She finally managed to scream, and the shriek she gave out cut through his mind. Instantly, he was back at the first night attack, hearing the most inhuman howls of settlers being digested alive. No matter how hard he pulled, he couldn't break the thread's hold. They were winning the dreadful tug of war. Cherry was slowly inching backward to the water's edge. The prehensile threads were also squirming up her body toward him, seeming to seek out the source of the resistance. Desperately, he cast about for something to cut the threads, but all around him was nothing but vegetation, sand, and water. All he had with him was his clothes. The moment he let go of Cherry, the threads would drag her into the water. Then there would be nothing he could do to save her. "Please," she gasped. "Please help me, please." "I'm trying. I can't pull any harder." As he spoke, his hand slipped on her arms, and Cherry jerked closer to the lake. She gave another shriek. He quickly grabbed her again and tugged with every ounce of strength he had, but he could only maintain a stalemate against the threads. There was no one for kilometers around, and even if he managed to calm someone, the struggle would be over long before help arrived.
I'm going to have to let you go, just for a moment.
No! Don't let go!
I have to run back to the plough. Try to hold on to the sand as hard as you can. Fight with everything you've got. Don't let them drag you into the water.
When she didn't answer, he said,
Cherry, do you understand? Don't let them drag you into the water.
Her face was drained of colour, but she managed a brave nod.
3, 2, 1.
He released his grip and flew back to the plough. As he swung the machine around, he pushed down a lever that looked like it might lower the blades. His heart surged as the long, sharp slices of metal moved downward. But then his heart fell as the turning machine brought him in sight of Cherry. She was scrabbling and clutching the ground like a wild thing, but she seemed to be having no impact on the inexorable tugging of the threads. She was nearly at the water's edge. He pushed the accelerator forward and the plough surged ahead. He would need to drive it into the lake to avoid cutting Cherry with the blades. The plough entered the lapping waves. He hoped the water wouldn't drown the engine. As he drove toward Cherry, he had to turn even deeper into the water or he would hit her. Her feet were submerged and only the threads wrapped around her legs remained visible. The threads jerked and pulled her deeper. The plough blades churned the water close enough to her to freeze his heart. He passed just beyond where he guessed her feet were, and the water filled with clouds of black sand and hundreds of pieces of thread, still wriggling as they bobbed to the surface. He was past her. He looked back. She was in the same spot. He turned the plough, watching her all the while. She pulled up a leg so she was on one knee. Then she was up and running. He steered the plough toward her. After running for half a minute into the vegetation, she stopped, looked around and found him, then sped over. She climbed quickly into the cab, covered in wet sand, raised, and still looking terrified. She grabbed him and sobbed into his chest. He comforted her until her weeping finally slowed. Wiping sand from her face and body, she said, "What the hell were those things? They were going to drown me. If you hadn't saved me, I'd be dead."
I don't know. When I think of the times I've walked along that shore by myself.
He shuddered.
We should head back to town and tell someone what's happened.
Yeah, let's go. We can use the flitter. He pushed the accelerator and turned the plough.
Only...
What's wrong? He peered back at the lake, then around at the low vegetation. Only what?
Those threads, or tentacles, or whatever they were. There were so many of them, and they were capable of moving an adult human.
You don't need to tell me that.
It was the first time the creature or creatures attacked one of us, but they didn't evolve to eat people, if that's what it had in mind.
I think I know where you're going. You mean whatever it usually eats is human-sized or bigger. I think I'm going to be sick. She wasn't speaking figuratively. She leaned out of the cab and vomited. When the spasm was over, she leaned back, looking exhausted.
Sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned it.
It's okay. I was going to do that anyway. Have you ever seen any large creatures out here? I haven't.
No, but the plants are knee-height. It wouldn't be hard for a large animal to conceal itself. All it would have to do is stay still, and it would be impossible for us to detect it. We could have walked right by something and never known it.
I think I'm going to be sick again.
The electric fences we set up aren't enough. We need the xenozoologists to go over the area again with a fine-toothed comb. I don't trust their report that the place is safe for farming. Not after today. When we get back, I'll comm the ship.
You mean you have to ask the Woken for help? Why? Why can't we handle this ourselves? Why do we always have to go running to them at the first sign of trouble?
It isn't like that.
It's exactly like that. They drove the rest of the way back in silence. Chapter 7. An announcement was to be made in the stadium. Cariad's gaze roved the gathering crowd as she waited. A gaping hole in the seating remained from the explosion. All loose material had been stripped away by the Guardians for investigation, and the structure temporarily braced for safety, a stark reminder of the terrible event. The sight of it made her newly fixed arm ache in psychosomatic sympathy. The mood was in sombre contrast to that at the naming ceremony. Most of the noise came from the people manoeuvring between the seats. No one was saying much, and what was said was conveyed in low voices, as if in fear of being overheard. Guardians had scanned thoroughly for bombs and found nothing, but the tension and unease was almost palpable. There was another marked contrast. At the naming ceremony, gens and woken and even Guardians had intermingled and seated themselves randomly. But now the groups were mostly sitting apart. She could identify gens and woken even at a distance due to their clothing styles. Both groups clothed themselves from the ship's printing facilities, but the woken sported the fashions of Earth at the time they'd left. Cariad wore the same exaggerated swirls and folds in muted shades herself. The gens, however, favoured tighter, more body-defining shapes and bolder colours. A patch of dark grey in the corner of the stadium represented the Guardians. They made up the smallest group, only 10 or 12 of them. Cariad knew Strongquist and a few others by name. The faces of the rest seemed to constantly change, as if they were serving shifts planet-side or aboard the Nova, which was probably the case. She had sat among gens, but no one was speaking to her. Looking around, she noticed that people were avoiding her gaze. The gens' attitude seemed to have changed within the last few days. Even those who hadn't been planet-side during the first night attack knew who she was, and previously everyone had been friendly. Now she was beginning to feel like a pariah. Something was happening within the colony. Groups were defining themselves into factions. She was strongly reminded of her conversation with Ethan about the gens' feelings about the woken, and Anahi's attitude that the settlers were divided into gens and us. The divisions didn't bode well for the future, but she didn't know what to do about it. "Hey!" Ethan sat next to her, and her spirits rose immediately. She had one friend at least. He must have sought her out among the crowd. "How are things down at the farm?" "You didn't hear what happened?" "I haven't heard much news. I've been busy." He related a story about a farmer being attacked by an organism living in the lake. "That must have been terrifying. Was she okay?" "She didn't suffer any permanent injuries. Do you know what this announcement is about?" "I've no idea. I just received the message, the same as everyone else." The stadium sound system gave out low rumbles, indicating someone was about to speak. The background noise dropped to silence, and all eyes turned to the newly constructed speaker's box. A prominent gen called Garwin was standing there facing the crowd. Strongquist was in the box too, and another Guardian. A woman, she sat at the back with Strongquist behind Garwin. Anahi also stood there. "Gens, woken, Guardians," Garwin began. "Thank you all for coming here today. This meeting is long overdue. We've never gone so long without a leader." The mood seemed to soften. Garwin was well known and well respected among the gens. An older man, he had stood for election to be leader several times, but had never won, probably due to his reputation for philandering. While not particularly frowned on in gen culture, it gave the impression he was unreliable. He was a good speaker, however, and the gens were prepared to listen to him. "I'm pleased to tell you the election process will begin soon. I'm not going to be standing again. Don't worry. I don't need it spelled out to me. You don't want me, and that's fine. He spoke wryly and without rancour. Some gens began chanting, "Garwin for leader!" But the chant quickly faded when no one joined in. He raised a hand. "My chance has come and gone, my friends. As I said, the election process begins soon. We have important things to talk about before that happens." He paused as if to gather his thoughts. "It's been 30 days since we arrived at our new home, and what a tumultuous time it's been. Counting the gens and Woken who died in the first night attack and the stadium bombing, 55 people have been lost to us, and more have suffered serious injuries. The other day, we also nearly lost 2 more in a wildlife attack out at the lake." He looked down and shook his head before raising it to speak again. "Friends, we aren't well prepared for the dangers of our new lives. Whoever we elect as leader has a tough job ahead of him or her. The toughest leadership job ever in the history of the Nova Fortuna. But electing a new leader isn't enough. If we're to succeed and make this colony viable, we need to improve our game. All our lives, we gens have followed the guidelines laid down for us in the manual, but we weren't ready for what we found here. How could we be?" He spread his hands wide. "We only knew how to live aboard a starship. We'd never known danger, so how could we protect ourselves against it? Sure, we learned basic ideas about survival, but learning is one thing, practice is another. We've been doing our best, but it isn't enough. We need people with experience of a real world to lead us." Cariad had assumed that Garwin was going to try to dispel the unrest and calm people's fears, but the man's last few sentences brought her to a sharp focus. His words had begun to sound worryingly familiar. They were very similar to a certain person's opinions she'd heard only a short time ago. She was surprised to hear them coming from the mouth of a gen. She glanced around. The people nearest her were frowning. "It's time for a change," Garwin said. "There's an old Earth saying I've heard. Desperate times call for desperate measures. It's time that we rethink what we've been doing and invent a new way forward, a way that will save lives and bring us the success we need and deserve. I'd like you to listen to someone who has thought up a plan for that new way. It's a plan that promises to solve these problems we've been having and ensure a thriving, healthy colony for all." The previous warmth that Garwin's appearance had generated entirely drained away. Puzzled or concerned looks were turning angry. A Nahi stood. Cariad suddenly became very conscious of the fact that she was awoken, sitting among hundreds of gens. "Thank you for your wonderful introduction to my proposal." She turned to the crowd. "My name is Anahi, and I am what you call awoken. I was revived 2 years ago, along with roughly half the rest of the cryonically preserved. I want to speak to you today to give you my perspective on what's been happening. To say things have not gone according to plan would be a gross understatement. People have died. People have been injured. As some of you are no doubt aware, we are already behind the schedule laid out in the manual. I'm sure a few may be pointing the finger of blame at the natural movement, whose terrorists and saboteurs we've unfortunately brought along with us. And you would be entitled to do that. It was they who precipitated the first night attack, and it was a natural movement follower who planted the bomb in this very stadium. But the natural movement are not the only ones at fault here. We, the Woken, must also take some of the responsibility for the problems. It was we who unknowingly allowed natural movement members to infiltrate our ranks. It was we who were foolishly lax in putting security in place that might have prevented their terrorist acts. It was we who failed to anticipate the problems our new colony would encounter with native species. My friends, I am here today because I want to tell you we wish to make amends. Though Earth's best scientists did their utmost to create a viable plan for humanity's first deep space colony, we could not conceive of how that plan would play out in reality. Here, in our new home, we are finding that the information brought to us by probes was inaccurate. This planet harbours far more dangers than we realised. But all is not lost. The Guardians are helping us to root out the saboteurs, and we Woken can fix other problems. We can start anew, armed with fresh knowledge, gleaned from on-the-ground experience. We want to help, not only for our own sakes, but for yours. The Nova Fortuna was built for you. This planet is yours. Anahi held up a finger. But you need a new plan, a new manual written to see you through these fledgling days, based on everything we now know and everything that our current experiments discover. We Woken need to be more proactive. Simply put, we need more control. I would like to propose that, while this emergency situation continues, generational colonists take a step back. When we have assessed what needs to be done, we will tell you. We will guide you, as we did during your time aboard the Nova Fortuna, as we guided your ancestors for generations. In order to do this, the next leader should be a Woken. That did it. Angry murmurings had been growing around Cariad while Anahi spoke. At her last sentence, the murmuring broke into yells and shouts. Expletives were hurled. "Friends! Friends!" Anahi called. "Listen to what I have to say. This would be a temporary measure only, until—" The noise from the crowd drowned her words. Anahi gave up and returned to her seat. Strongquist stepped forward. Simultaneously, Guardians appeared from the tunnels leading to the stadium field. Armed Guardians. Cariad clutched her seat. No Guardians had carried weapons since the first night attack, when they had fired at the predators invading the camp. Their firearms were slim, sleek weapons, clearly far in advance of the weapons brought aboard the Nova. She could hardly believe they were being used to control the gens, for it was the stands filled with gens that the Guardians went toward. They left the Woken alone. A shocked hush settled on the crowd. Strongquist began to speak.
"Please, do not be alarmed. The armed guards are for your own safety. I understand that you are upset at Anahi's proposal. I anticipated that it might not be well received, and I am sorry to say that I was correct. I want to make it clear that we do not want anyone here today to be hurt. We want to protect you. That, after all, was our role during the first night attack, and that has been our aim since. You have called us your guardians, and we will not shirk that task. So please, do not be alarmed. When emotions run high, crowds can get out of control, and then people get hurt. Remain calm in your seats, and no one will be in any danger. We will give more information about the election for the new leader at a later date. Meanwhile, I would like to answer the many inquiries we have received about the state of things on Earth. Gens and Woken alike are naturally very curious about their old home. I wanted to take this opportunity to satisfy that curiosity. In order to do that, I have brought Faina here to speak to you. She is our captain. She can outline the pertinent facts for you." The Guardian woman stood. Her dark grey short hair matched her uniform, and when she spoke, her voice was crisp and loud. "Gens, thank you for this opportunity. I acknowledge that the time for answers is long overdue, and I apologise for that. We felt that you were all psychologically vulnerable after the first night attack." Cariad and Ethan shared a puzzled look. Whatever the Guardian was about to say, it didn't sound like anything good.
I will first answer the question that's on many lips. I'm sorry, but there is no going back. It's true that our ship travels faster than light. It's also true that we could take some of you to Earth tomorrow. But it is an Earth that none of you would want to live on. Our origin planet is full, and its resources depleted. Mars is full. Ganymede and Ceres are full. There is nowhere for you to go. Gens and Woken, your new home is a difficult place to live. There's no denying it. But it's your home. It must be, and so you must make the best of it. The Guardians wholeheartedly endorse Anahi's proposal that the next leader should be a Woken. We are prepared to enforce this. This colony must succeed, and the Woken have the expertise to ensure it. We are lending them our support to safeguard everyone's survival. Faina sat down, and no one rose to take her place. The announcement was over. The armed guards moved away from the stands, walking backward toward the centre of the field. It was the signal that the audience was free to leave, or perhaps that they had to leave. The gens filed silently out of their seats. "I can't believe it," Cariad said quietly to Ethan as they stood to take their place going down the stairs. "Me neither. The gens already have a grudge against the Woken. And Anahi doesn't respect the gens." They'd reached the bottom of the stairs. "I want to talk to her. I'll see you later." "Okay, take care." Cariad sped around the edge of the field until she spied the person she wanted and walked quickly over. She caught up to Anahi as she was about to enter an exit tunnel. Strongquist, Faina and Garwin were ahead of her. The Woken stopped and turned when Cariad touched her arm. She pulled the older woman to the side of the tunnel, out of the way of the crowd. "What the hell are you doing?" Cariad whispered fiercely. "Do you have any idea what you've started? They already dislike us." "So what? All children hate their parents, and that's what they're like. Children. They need our guidance, and now they're going to get it, whether they like it or not." "You're an idiot! You've handed over military control to the Guardians. This isn't supposed to be a military state. What's wrong with you? We're supposed to be building a new kind of society here. A better society. Not another Earth with people murdering each other." "Ha! Weren't you one of the ones who insisted on bringing weapons along? Look, the situation's only temporary, okay? Until we get things back on track. I'm not prepared to sit around while some stupid gens cock everything up. When the colony is working, and when the gens gain some more experience of living in the real world, then we'll hand back control. But not until then." Maybe Anahi believed her own words. Cariad wasn't sure. Maybe she really was that deluded. Whatever she thought, if history was anything to go by, the Woken had just started the events that were going to repeat it. A battle for independence and control was coming. "I thought that you were going to propose that we revive more Woken, like you said at the final decanting." "Oh no, why would I propose that to the gens? We don't need their permission to restart the revival process. At least now we don't." Chapter 8. Ethan stood at Dr. Crowley's grave, hardly able to believe that it had been only just over a month since they'd buried her. The remains of the other victims from the first night attack were also buried in the small graveyard, along with those who had died in the stadium bombing. The soil on the bombing victims' graves was still fresh, while on Dr. Crowley's, the moss-like native ground cover had already overgrown it and was creeping up the gravestone. He cleared the tendrils away, detaching them with some difficulty, as their roots gripped tightly to the stone. When he had cleared off the surface, he sat on the ground and stared at the inscription. "Meredith Crowley, Star Voyager, your journey is over. May you rest in peace. Far beyond the graveyard, a roadmaker trundled along, its square, bulky form inching across the horizon, dark against the sky. Even with the intervening distance, its deep bass hum penetrated as it turned the native soil and rocks to firm, cambered roads. Some days he almost forgot that Dr. Crowley had died. Then the memory of that awful sight of her, trapped beneath the alien predator, would resurface like a wound torn open, and his grief would rise up, fresher than ever. He wished she was still alive. Everything seemed to be going wrong, and he didn't know what to do about it. What would Dr. Crowley have said about what happened at the stadium meeting? He suspected she wouldn't have approved of the Woken's proposal to take over the leadership of the colony. She would have definitely protested the Guardians' use of guns to control the gens. He was certain of that because she and Cariad had argued about having weapons aboard the Nova. Dr. Crowley had been against the idea. She had believed the colony should be founded upon non-violent principles. He recalled one of the talks they'd had not long after they'd become friends. They'd met in the ship's main park as they usually did, beneath the clock. He had spent the morning studying the fertilizer requirements of root crops, and he was numb with boredom. He perked up when he saw the older woman waiting for him, reading an interface she held in one hand.
"Doctor, sorry I'm late."
"Are you? I hadn't noticed." Dr. Crowley looked up at the clock. "Only a few minutes." She closed her interface and slipped it into a pocket. "Where would you like to go today?" The time they spent together usually followed the same pattern. He would suggest a section or facility for them to visit, and Dr. Crowley would explain the history behind the place as far as she knew it. The colonization project had involved tens of thousands of people, and she wasn't familiar with all its aspects. He found it fascinating to hear about the building of the Nova from the perspective of someone who had actually been there when it took place. Dr. Crowley would name long-dead space architects and engineers she'd known personally, but to him they were historical figures. That day, however, he hadn't been in the mood for a trip into the past.
"How about we go to the observatory?"
"You want to go there again? I think I've told you all I can remember about it."
"That's why I want to go. I'm kinda tired, and I don't think I'll take much in today. It would be good to relax for a while."
"Sure, if that's what you want." The observatory was quiet as usual. They sat down and reclined the seats until they were nearly lying flat. Dr. Crowley asked after some moments of silence, "Is something bothering you, Ethan?"
"What makes you say that?"
"You're quiet. You usually have lots of questions for me. It isn't just that you're tired, is it?"
"I'm okay. I'm just bored of my course."
"I remember you telling me once that you would rather be an explorer than a farmer. I think if that's what you want to do, you should do it."
"It isn't as easy as that. Exploring was removed as an option when they revised the manual."
Dr. Crowley's pff of disgust came through the darkness. "You know what I think of the new manual. I'm sorry, Ethan, but no one gave gens the mandate to rewrite the manual. Scientists and engineers with decades of experience in the outer planets put those guidelines together. I appreciate that it's gens who will be impacted by the rules, but that doesn't give them the right to change them. No explorers? Nonsense. And forcing people into occupations they have no interest in or aptitude for is even more unwise. I have to tell you, I have grave reservations about the success of the colony if we follow the revisions that were made to the manual." "Grave." Somewhat subdued by the older woman's ire, he didn't respond. After a short while she continued, "I would hate to see our new home go the way of Earth. I don't know what you understand from the vids and learning resources, but politicking is one of the greatest flaws in human nature. The lust for power and desire to control others is a highly addictive, corrupting drug. I've read the revised manual, and the motivation to change things for the sake of leaving a mark, to know that the new guidelines would affect others for generations, is written clearly between the lines. It worried me to see it. Perhaps I'm only a foolish old woman, but I had hoped we would leave such evils behind. I had hoped such things were taught, not instinctive, and that if we could shape the gens' education to promote egalitarianism and empathy, you wouldn't develop such traits. It seems, alas, I was wrong. Ethan, I've been meaning to tell you this for some time, and I suppose this is as good a time as any. You have some wonderful qualities, and I believe you should put them to better use. I hope you don't mind my frankness when I say that you seem to think less of yourself because you weren't top of the class at school. But after getting to know you, I have to conclude that the education system we devised did you a disservice. Either that or the guidelines in the manual for teaching were also revised. You strike me as a very intelligent, capable young man. What's more, you're very personable. You would be very popular if you put yourself out there more. Dr. Crowley's words made him uncomfortable. He wasn't sure how he'd given the doctor such a positive impression. Was she trying to make him feel better about not wanting to be a farmer? What I'm trying to say is, it wouldn't hurt you to have a little more faith in yourself. You have a lot to offer. Don't be afraid to speak out if you think something isn't right. Believe me, it seems there will be plenty of people vying for power in the not-too-distant future, and they won't be the ones who should be leading the colony. It's people like you, people who don't want to lead. They're the gens who will serve the colony best. Watching the stars move slowly past, he weighed his friend's words.
It's good of you to say that, but I don't think I'll be leading anyone anywhere. I just can't see myself doing that.
Can you see yourself being a farmer?
Nope.
We have a long way to go yet. Think about what I said. The colony will need a very special leader after arrival. A stiff breeze had started to blow through the graveyard, and the chill brought him out of his reverie. While he'd been musing over the past, shelf clouds had risen, towering tsunami-like overhead. The roadmaker had edged farther along the horizon. For the first time since he'd had that conversation with Dr. Crowley in the observatory, he began to wonder if there was some truth to what she'd said. After the first night attack, as the Guardians prepared to execute the natural movement saboteur, Strongquist had called him a hero. It was true he'd been one of the few to keep his head during the attack. Maybe Dr. Crowley had been right when she'd said he had more to offer the colony than he'd thought. Maybe he could do something to stop what was happening with the Woken and the Guardians. "Hi, Ethan," came a voice from behind him. He started and turned. It was Cherry.
"Hi."
"Sorry I made you jump."
"It's okay, but you do seem to have a habit of appearing from nowhere."
"But it's always good to see me, right?" She smiled impishly, and he was forced to smile in return.
"I guess so."
"So much enthusiasm," Cherry exclaimed sardonically. "That's what I like."
"Well..."
"I'm just messing with you. I was looking for you because I wanted to ask you to come along to a meeting."
"What kind of meeting?"
"A meeting about what happened at the stadium."
"Right. Who's going?"
"Some gens. You'll see when we get there. They wanted me to invite you."
"No Woken?"
"Definitely no Woken." He thought about it.
"Okay, I'll come."
"Good. I was hoping you'd agree. And Ethan, I'm sorry for saying that you were taking the Woken side that day out at the lake. I don't really think you're like that."
"No problem,"
he said, thinking her reversal a little odd. "Shall we go?" He stood, stretching his stiff muscles, and walked with Cherry back to the settlement. She led him to a newly built shop. In time, it would sell groceries. Cash vouchers were to be introduced to start a fledgling economy until a commercial network and credit system was set up. For the moment, the place functioned as a supplies storehouse. Colonists collected them according to their allowance every day. By the time Ethan and Cherry arrived, that day's rations had been given out and the building was quiet. She took him around the back and through a door leading to the stockroom. Food supplies in sacks and large tubs filled it to the ceiling, and the musty odour of dried grains and beans tinged the air. Cherry opened the door to another back room. This was packed with chairs and people. Only one corner was empty, and a man stood there, addressing the meeting. The man was the last person Ethan had expected to see. It was Garwin.
"Ethan, good of you to join us. Come in, come in."
The attendees shuffled chairs aside so he and Cherry could move to spare seats.
"I had just begun explaining the situation to the newcomers,"
Garwin said.
"I know it must be confusing, hearing me say one thing in the stadium and another thing here. The fact of the matter is, I and a few of the others have seen the way things were going for a while now. Since before arrival day even. We didn't think the Woken would continue to leave control of the colony to us gens for much longer. We knew what would happen, and we knew we would need someone on the inside when it did. So I've been friendly with the Woken and gone along with what they've said. I've made them believe there are gens who are sympathetic to their position and support them. Believe it or not, they really think there are some of us who like to be treated like we're inferior."
This elicited both chuckles and grumbles among the listeners.
"The Woken trust me," Garwin went on. "Idiots that they are. I believe they'll tell me what they have planned, and we can use that information and turn it against them. We can take back control. We have the numbers, and pretty soon we'll have the weapons too."
It was a resistance meeting. Suddenly, Cherry's professed change of opinion about him made sense. They were hoping to bring him over to their side, and after the events at the stadium, he wouldn't take much persuasion. He didn't think any gen would.
"Yes, weapons," Garwin continued. "That's one reason you see a lot of farmers here. We've singled you out because after the creature in the lake attacked Cherry, you've been allocated guns for protection. We're lucky the decision was made before the stadium announcement. I believe they're regretting it already. It's my prediction that the Woken's next move is going to be to tell the Guardians to relieve you of your weapons at the earliest opportunity. So what I'm saying is, if you already have a gun, don't give it up. Make an excuse. Tell the Guardians you'll bring it in, then don't. Tell them you were never given one or you lost it. They think we're stupid, so it's more likely they'll believe you. Hell, just refuse if you want to, but don't give up your guns. We'll store them, ready for the day we fight back. Right?"
Ethan found himself nodding along with the rest. He'd received a weapon 3 days ago.
"Ethan,"
Garwin said. He stretched out an arm.
"Come up here."
With the gaze of everyone in the room upon him, Ethan felt he had no choice but to comply. However, going up in front of the other gens didn't make him as uncomfortable as he'd thought it would. Things had gone too far. They were being wronged. They couldn't trust the Woken or the Guardians anymore. And he agreed with Garwin that they had to do something about it. He would do something about it. As he stepped through the chairs, someone began to clap. Garwin motioned downward with his hands to quieten the clapper.
"We mustn't make too much noise. We don't know who might hear."
He put an arm over Ethan's shoulders and spoke to the audience.
"Here he is, the man who saved hundreds of lives in the first night attack. He's quick-thinking, brave, and he doesn't give up. With Ethan on our side, we can't go wrong."
"That's right," called a voice. To his surprise, Ethan found himself speaking.
"I'm just another gen like all of you. What's happening to us isn't right, and I'll do my best to fight alongside you to change it. But I want to say one thing. Don't think all the Woken are the same. They don't all agree with what's going on. We have friends among them who'll help us."
From some expressions he could tell not all of them believed him, but they were keeping their opinions to themselves for the time being.
"Wise words,"
Gawain said.
"And I'll also say the Woken have friends among us, though I'm not one of them."
He grinned broadly, eliciting some laughs.
"So be careful who you speak to. Is there anything else you'd like to say, Ethan? I'm done for now." "Right."
Gawain addressed the room.
"Going forward, I think we should hold each meeting at a different place, day and time. Between now and the next meeting, we need to watch and learn everything we can about what the Guardians and the Woken are doing. Everyone, watch, listen, and remember. Don't make a record of anything except in your own heads. Don't write anything down. The next meeting is..."
He gave the details.
"Finally, farmers, don't give up your weapons. Thanks, everyone. Until next time."
The meeting began to break up. Those nearest the door slipped out. The rest waited, chatting before leaving in small numbers at irregular intervals, so that their movements weren't too noticeable. Gawain spoke to Ethan about the inner circle of Gen insurgents. As he listened, he was surprised to discover that certain gens had banded together months previously, even before arrival, and begun preparations to fight the Woken, guessing they would try to assume control.
"The only thing we didn't factor into the equation,"
Gawain said,
"was the Guardians. It was quite a surprise when they turned up."
"A pleasant surprise at the time," Ethan said, recalling how it was only through a Guardian's intervention that he was saved from a grisly death.
"Maybe. They've shown their hand since then. I can't disagree, but I think something else is missing from your equation. The natural movement. What about them? Where do they fit into all this? I confess that we don't have that figured out yet. Who they are, how many they are, whether they're Woken or gens, we're as much in the dark as anyone else."
Ethan wasn't sure if it was due to the man's convincing speeches on both the Woken and gens sides, or due to something more subtle about his manner, but he didn't think that Gawain was being entirely open. Someone tapped him on his shoulder, signalling that it was his turn to leave. He said goodbye to Gawain and went out. It was dusk, and the shelf clouds had risen higher, looming swollen and black over the small town. When he arrived at the farmer's hostel, a Guardian was awaiting him. She told him he had to surrender his gun. Chapter 9. As far as Cariad knew, she was the first of the colonists who had been invited aboard the Mistral. At least, she'd never heard of anyone going to the Guardian ship before, and that news would have spread through the colony like wildfire. The Mistral shuttle had arrived not long after she'd received the comm from Strongquist. He'd said he wanted to talk about the stadium bombing, and it would be more convenient if she were to go to the Mistral. With the Nova's reproductive facilities mothballed and human reproduction planet-side only just starting up, she was at a loose end and eager to help. She was also eager to learn more about the mysterious Guardians and their intentions. The colonists' relationship with the newcomers had never been formalized, no agreements made or guarantees given. The Guardians had stuck to their story that they were here to help protect the colony from the natural movement sabotage plot, and according to the Guardian captain's recent announcement, they were also generally intent on safeguarding the colony's success. On the surface, it added up, but their ready acquiescence to Anahi's request for armed support of Woken control made Cariad deeply uneasy. What else might the Guardians do if asked? Where would they draw the line? Their tech was far superior to that of the Nova. That much was clear from their weapons, the medical assistance they offered, and their shuttle. The same would be true of their ship. What she'd seen of the small, sleek vessel seemed to indicate it. Most importantly, it had caught up to the Nova at the end of her long journey by the means of a faster-than-light engine. If the Guardians used that tech to help the colony, that would be to the good. But if they changed their attitude, neither the Gens nor the Woken would be able to do much to resist them. In truth, these visitors from an Earth she had never known held the fate of the colony in their hands. It might end up depending on them, and then they would have the ultimate control. The Guardians had arrived in the nick of time during the first night attack and saved many lives. But things might have turned out better overall without their presence. She sat alone in the small passenger cabin of the Mistral shuttle. The Guardian's vessel was smaller than the Nova's transport craft, but its superior quality and capability was clear. Her seat conformed perfectly to her body, and the shuttle had wide windows in the passenger cabin. The movement was smooth and unaccompanied by engine noise, and it seemed to be moving incredibly quickly. Below, the planet's surface skimmed past, and the Mistral soon loomed up. She had seen it before through scanners, but up close it looked even more impressive. Its proportions perfect. The ship's designers clearly hadn't focused only on its FTL capabilities. It was also an aesthetic masterpiece, and in marked contrast to the Nova Fortuna's massive clunky wheel. Had the Earth engineers built any more like this? The next moment the shuttle was docking. As soon as the portal opened, air infiltrated the cabin. It smelled different from that aboard the Nova. Circulation and filtration units worked hard on the colony ship to eliminate odours. But after a trip planet-side, the slightly sweaty, mouldy smell of the interior was distinct. The air aboard the Mistral smelled clean and mildly fragrant. Stromquist was here to meet her. His dark eyes were deep and unreadable, as always.
"Thank you for coming."
"It's my pleasure. I admit I'm curious about your ship. Am I the first you've invited aboard?"
"You know, I think you are."
"Huh. You say that like it wasn't intentional. You must know how curious we all are about you." She was skating the line of politeness. She didn't want to overstep and cut short her welcome, but on the other hand, she wanted to take advantage of the favour Stromquist was showing. His expression became grave. Had she pushed things too far?
"Curiosity is to be expected, I guess."
He left his response at that, shutting the conversation down.
"Come this way, please."
As they went through the ship's corridors, she noticed there was a total absence of grime. The Nova had her Sanobots, simple, fist-sized, self-repairing machines that constantly crawled the ship's surfaces, brushing and wiping as they went. They would automatically discharge into trash chutes and return to recharging stations when they ran low on power. But Sanobots weren't perfect. There were areas they couldn't reach, and others that, for some reason, their programming missed, resulting in certain ever-present patches of dirt. Whatever was maintaining the cleanliness aboard the Guardian ship was doing an excellent job. Not only were there no permagrime spots, every surface gleamed like new. She asked what was cleaning the ship. Stromquist replied with something that sounded like gibberish. "I never heard that word before. Is it a trade name?"
"It's just what we call the nano that cleans the ship."
"Weird. It sounds like a word from another language."
"It's English."
Her brows knitted. She was no linguist, but it didn't sound like any English she knew.
"You have to understand, English evolved after the Nova Fortuna departed. You would probably find modern English difficult to follow."
"I thought I was speaking modern English."
"You speak mid-third millennium English, as do the Gens. Their leisure and learning materials are all in mid-third English."
Wait a minute. How can I understand you if English evolved so much after we left? He gave a rare smile.
You can understand me because I'm speaking mid-third English. Here we are.
They stepped into a small room that had consoles on every wall.
I've been doing some more investigating into the name you gave me, searching the recordings we have from 20 years before and after the Nova Fortuna departed.
20 years after we left? Why so long?
While your ship was within reasonable distance from Earth, transmissions could have been sent and received pertaining to the natural movement sabotage plot.
But not after 20 years?
Perhaps, but it was less likely. There was also a limit to how much data we could bring. We have millions of zettabytes.
She was about to ask another question, but Strongquist said,
I have something I want to show you.
He looked toward the empty space in the center of the room. A hollow started up, though she hadn't seen him do anything to start it. Was he using a mind interface? Researchers had been working on prototypes in her time, but no one had been able to tolerate the web insert in their brain. She was looking at an above-head view into a lobby, as if the camera had been stationed on the ceiling. Glass walls allowed a view of a street, and on the opposite wall stood a line of elevators. The lobby was empty. From the dim light shining outside, it was either around dawn or dusk. If it was dusk, the place seemed quiet. What am I looking at exactly?
I don't want to suggest anything to you. Just watch and tell me what you notice.
A figure appeared coming down the street, a man wearing fashions from her time. As he approached the glass doors, they opened. He came into the lobby and stepped to the elevator. While he waited, another figure entered, a woman. Both were dressed for office work. Their clothes were light and cool, suggesting it was summer. It was a very ordinary scene, but a strong sense of displacement struck her. These people arriving for work were long dead, though from her perspective they'd been alive only 2 years previously. She was now living in a future people of her time had only dreamed of. Yet to the Guardians, she was a living relic, speaking an archaic language. The man and woman had entered an elevator and disappeared, but more people were arriving. It would help if you would tell me what I'm looking for, she said, her feeling of dislocation giving way to frustration. She wanted to catch the natural movement terrorists, not play Strongquist's games.
I can't. If I did that, I couldn't rely on what you tell me. The human mind is very suggestible. Eyewitnesses are notoriously unreliable.
Witnesses? Was something about to happen? Was a bomb about to go off? She scanned the scene.
It would be helpful if you would watch the people.
The lobby now held 8 workers. Another appeared and joined a group congregating around an approaching elevator. The new figure was a man. Something about his features attracted her attention. She leaned forward to look more closely. It was hard to see his face clearly due to the camera angle, but there was something about him. She touched Strongquist's arm. Immediately the scene froze. He'd stopped it somehow.
What do you see, Cariad?
That man! She pointed, her finger poking through his face in the hollow. She hesitated. The feeling was tenuous. She didn't trust it, especially as the hollow had frozen when the man's face was slightly turned away. Can you let it play on? The hollow started up, and as if on cue, the man turned and looked upward, almost directly at the camera. It was like he was aware and concerned that he was being recorded, though from the direction of his gaze, it was clear he couldn't see the camera. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside and was gone. The hollow played on. She turned to Strongquist. I think I recognize that man.
Where do you know him from? Do you remember?
She mentally replayed the moving image of the man's face. Not right now. I can't place him, but I'll think about it.
I have other scenes I can show you to help jog your memory.
You do? I'd like to see them. The hollow was replaced by another. It was a laboratory at night. So you were showing me that man among other people, hoping I would pick him out?
If I'd shown you only his image, you might have been convinced you knew him simply because it was obvious he must be important in some way. I needed you to pick him out from a crowd.
Wait a minute. The hollow stopped. Who is the man I saw?
I was hoping you would know.
Huh? If you don't know who he is, what makes you think I would know him? Strongquist only looked at her. The penny dropped. It's Frederick Aparicio, isn't it?
We believe so.
So I did know him, or I wouldn't have recognized him. But where from? She thought back to the time of the Nova Fortuna project. She was sure that Frederick Aparicio wasn't a distant relative. She was also sure he hadn't been a work colleague either. The work on the project had been intense and relationships extremely familiar. Everyone had spent most of their waking hours on the job. Some had even slept on site. Perhaps Aparicio had been one of the more peripheral workers. They'd numbered in their thousands. But if that were the case, why did his name and face stick out?
Should I play the next hollow?
Yes, but I wanted to ask, how are you controlling it? Strongquist smiled.
The lesson in modern tech will have to wait for another day, I'm afraid. Now, if you don't mind.
His eyebrows gestured to the scene in the lab, frozen in mid-air. Go ahead. She watched 4 more hollows of Frederick Aparicio before Strongquist said that was all they had on him. She couldn't tell him any more, but said she would let the Guardian know as soon as she remembered anything. Can I take the recordings with me to watch them again?
Of course. I had them converted to play on the Nova Fortuna's drives.
He took a vidring from his pocket and handed it over. She took it, wondering why, if she could have watched the hollows on the Nova, the Guardian had brought her here.
Would you like a tour of the ship before you go?
I'd love it. He took her to the bridge first. It was surprisingly similar to the Nova's. Much less instrumentation adorned the consoles, however. The Guardian's present didn't offer any greeting, but one stood up as she walked in. She recognized Faina, who had addressed the crowd at the stadium. Cariad, welcome to the bridge. Strongquist said he was bringing you aboard. What do you think of the ship? Was there tension behind the woman's words, or was it a subtle anger directed at Strongquist? The man's expression was as enigmatic as ever. I haven't seen a lot of it yet, but it's very interesting. Amazing, even. Everything's so much more advanced than on the Nova. It's to be expected, but coming here, I feel like I've stepped into the future. Our ship was the pinnacle of human development when we left, but I'm going to struggle to see it like that now. Don't forget that our ships serve different purposes, Faina said. The Nova Fortuna was built for stamina, not speed, and she was intended to be home to 2,000. Our ship was built for speed and not for comfort. The slight hesitation was almost unnoticeable. Almost. What had Faina been about to say before she changed her mind? But I could talk forever about my ship, the Guardian continued. Don't let me keep you. I'm sure Strongquist has plenty more he'd like to show you. Cariad would have loved to stay longer to discuss the Mistral's specs, but Strongquist was already ushering her away. As they went down the corridor, she asked, So Faina speaks mid-third English for our benefit too?
That's right.
You all learned the language before leaving Earth?
We learned it on the way.
You all speak it so well. I can't hear a trace of your original accent. How long did it take you to learn?
Not long. Would you like to see the FTL engine?
You can actually see it?
Oh, yes.
By the time her visit was over, she had seen the living, eating and recreational quarters, supply hold and engineering section. She attempted to extract more information from Strongquist, but he politely and adeptly deflected her enquiries. She was left with few answers and a growing sense of unease. The end. This has been the Concordia Deception, Space Colony 1, Book 1, written and narrated by J.J. Green. The next book in the Space Colony 1 series is The Feeler Epiphany, Space Colony 1, Book 2. For more J.J. Green books, visit jjgreenauthor.com.